We're going to be starting in just a minute here. It's going to be a longer stream tonight. Welcome to the Pipeline Podcast. Tonight we have coverage of the grooming gang inquiry report by Rupert Lowe. So this took place in the UK. There's been we'll get into it a lot tonight, but basically it's not really grooming games. It's like R-word gangs that go around like sexually assaulting children in the UK, and it's mostly Pakistani Muslim men. Mostly them. I believe it was 87% of the criminals were Pakistani Muslim. It says it somewhere in this report that we'll get into, but basically what we're doing tonight is we're gonna read through this whole thing so you don't have to. You can just listen to me read it to you. Because a lot of people are probably gonna try to ignore this story. That's what we've seen time and time again. There's been a lot of whistleblowers saying like, hey, there's a problem here. My children are getting like sexually assaulted. When they go to the police station in the UK, the police don't want to look into it because they don't want to be called racist. And it's becoming very systemic in the UK. So this inquiry report got dropped today. Rupert Lowe, who's like a politician in the UK, has been working on this. He's been very vocal about this for a long time. And so I think it'll be a pretty big story. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the entire report. It's about 200 pages, 219 pages. There is some testimony that takes up like a lot of this that we might read some of the testimony, but not all of it, because we're more worried about like the larger scale like implications of this. Like you have in the UK, it looks like they're importing like a different kind of culture, and it is destroying the country. And it's even affecting like the youth. Like these grooming gangs are targeting children, like underage children. And so a lot of people will shit on like the Epstein class. Well, you have, I don't know, like the Pakistani class that's kind of doing the same thing, and they're both bad. Either way, let's get into it. Again, just for YouTube's algorithm's sake, the R word here, we're gonna hold off. We're gonna change the R word with grooming, so we're gonna call it grooming gangs. Just for, I don't know, maybe the first 10 minutes or so until we get past any YouTube filters. Then we'll be able to actually say what is actually happening. But for now, for a little bit, we do have to moderate ourselves. So, the grooming gang inquiry report. Got the nice a table of contents here. Acknowledgements. Every witness who volunteered their testimony, whether survivor, parent, whistleblower, politician, or expert, showed courage that made this inquiry possible. Their contributions have ensured that the truth is now a matter of permanent public record. Rupert Lowe MP's energy and commitment ensured that the grooming gang inquiry took place. He has been unwavering in his devotion to make sure that this rotting stain on our country's history has remained firmly in the public eye. And so if you're tuning in from the US, this is in the UK. So they're talking about the UK here. Deep gratitude is extended to the entire inquiry team led by Sammy Woodhouse, Nat Enderby Shenton, Marlon West, Deborah Sodbury, and Julie Ballin. Worked tirelessly to bring the evidence together and support every survivor who came forward, which there was a lot of victims. A special thank you is owed to MPs Esther McVeigh, Nick Timothy, and Carla Lockhart for taking the time to sit on the inquiry panel. Dr. Mark Dury has been extremely generous in enriching the report that follows with his expert knowledge. We are also grateful to Charlie Downs, Joshua Firm, Harrison Pitt, and Graham Smith for their editorial oversight and counsel. Last but not least, we thank the untold thousands across Britain who made all of this possible by donating to ensure that this inquiry could take place. So that's interesting. You'd think something as problematic as this grooming gang stuff would be funded by the government, but it looks like they're implying here that they used public donations just to do this inquiry. Which, if that's true, if it was like entirely publicly funded and not funded by the government, it just goes to show you like how much like the government is trying to like hide this in the UK. They don't want people to know about this. Forward, Britain doesn't have a racism problem, it has an immigration problem. Totally agree. Rupert Lowe, as is the case with many decent, hardworking Britons, I was unaware of the sheer scale of the evil that has been and continues to be perpetrated. Oh, sorry, perpetrated. I might need to zoom this in a little bit. Here we go. Perpetrated by chiefly Pakistani Muslim men against vulnerable young white women and girls in communities up and down our country. But a single court transcript from one such horrific case, amplified by Elon Musk earlier last year, set in motion a long overdue national reckoning on the matter that inspired over 20,000 British patriots to help fund our grooming gang inquiry. What follows is a comprehensive report of its findings. It is essential that all related court documents are securely preserved, both for legal and historical reasons. I'm grateful to everyone on my team who has contributed to exposing this demonic chapter in Britain's history, a combination of the paralyzing fear of racism accusations and the scramble for votes from imported foreign subcultures meant that pure evil was allowed to what even is this one? Here, we gotta have Google pronounce this. Again, it is the UK, so their choice of words is a little bit different.
Metastasize.
Metastasize. Was allowed to metastasize. Nor is the horrendous ordeal over. The root cause was immigration, beginning with the British Nationality Act 1948 and escalating under Tony Blair from 1997 onwards. Believing proud nations to be responsible for the mid-20th century destruction of Europe, our post-war leaders embraced diversity and multiculturalism as the supposedly civilized alternative. This report establishes beyond any doubt that this open society obsession has in fact enabled untold barbarism of its own. Oil and water do not mix with cultural differences. Going back centuries are the genesis of this problem. Sorry, here it's oil and water do not mix, and cultural differences going back centuries are the genesis of this problem. I urge all Britons to read this report in full, so you're welcome that I'll read it to you. Lessons need to be learned and prosecutions need to follow for the appalling cowardice of those responsible for refusing to resist such horrors. The strongest possible penalties, up to and including death, must also be sought for those yet to be properly punished or indeed punished at all for their vile, unspeakable crimes. The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. Got a nice Albert Einstein quote. Man is the cruelest animal. Another quote. Introduction. The Rape Gang Inquiry has now concluded the first phase of its work. It was established to examine one of the most horrendous scandals in the long history of our country, the systematic targeting of vulnerable girls, overwhelmingly white British by predominantly Muslim Pakistani gangs across towns and cities up and down the nation. The evidence presented throughout the hearings confirmed what had long been known but repeatedly denied by many in the political class. The inquiry welcomed girls, boys, men, and women of all races and religion to testify to their experiences to gain a complete picture of the rape gang phenomenon. The Casey report of 2025 stated that disproportionate numbers of men from Asian ethnic backgrounds were among the suspects for group-based child sexual exploitation. Baroness Casey quoted local reports showing that a significant portion of those convicted were of Pakistani and or Muslim heritage. The crimes stretch back generations. The rape gang inquiry was necessary because the state and its institutions have failed catastrophically over decades. Police, social services, schools, the NHS, licensing authorities, and governments allowed these gangs to operate with impunity. There was a demonstrable lack of political will to confront them. The Labour Party initially refused a public inquiry altogether, only relenting under considerable pressure. It will be many years before this inquiry is complete, and there is no guarantee that it will adequately address the politically sensitive, ethno-religious nature of the phenomenon. Despite now pushing for an inquiry in opposition, when in government, the Conservative Party did very little. The rape gang inquiry was survivor-led. Every day the panel sat with Sammy Woodhouse, a survivor turned activist herself, alongside a variety of experts who attended whenever their specialist subject formed the focus of our efforts to get to the truth. We examined distinct areas of the scandal in turn so that a maximally full picture could be established. Parents and carers described their experiences. Instances of pregnancy, abortion, and child born of rape were laid bare. Whistleblowers who had previously been ignored gave evidence. Policing and justice failures were documented. Social care, NHS services, including sexual health and mental health, education, taxi licensing, demographic trends, cultural and social issues, and ideological obstructions to justice were all scrutinized without restriction. Nothing was off the table. Misguided political correctness and cultural sensitivities played no part in the proceedings. The promise made to every donor was honored in full. The truth was pursued and justice was our only objective. Survivors were finally given the platform they had been denied for so long and were central to the inquiry. The full scale and nature of the crimes can now be placed on the public record. The true horror of what took place is no longer hidden. Although the inquiry lacked statutory powers, the response was overwhelming. Politicians, whistleblowers, experts, family members, and many others came forward. Those few in prominent positions who declined to give evidence did so knowing their refusal would be noted. This report sets out findings and makes clear recommendations for how the problem of rape gangs can be eradicated. The country now knows the full truth. The country has been given the basis for justice. The country has the roadmap to ensure these crimes never happen again. Here we have the executive summary. The rape gang inquiry examined the systemic targeting of vulnerable girls, overwhelmingly white British by predominantly Muslim Pakistani gangs across towns and cities throughout the United Kingdom. The evidence put to the inquiry confirms that this scandal constitutes one of the most horrendous failures in the history of the country. Organized networks of perpetrators built coordinated operations that transported victims between locations, supplied them with drugs and alcohol, recorded abuse for distribution and blackmail, and passed girls between multiple adult men. These crimes have been committed for decades, since the 1950s, by Pakistanis in particular, and have affected every region of our nation. The scale of the crimes committed is staggering. It has been previously established that, at the very least, 250,000 young white girls have been subjected to repeated rape, gang rape, trafficking, torture, pregnancy, forced Islamic conversion, and lifelong trauma. The true number is probably higher. The perpetrators bear primary responsibility, yet the institutional failures that enabled them for decades must also be confronted. In court records and official inquiries, around 87% of those convicted in these group-based child sexual exploitation cases bore distinctively Muslim names. The vast majority of men involved in these gangs were not convicted. Dr. Taj Hargri, an imam with the Oxford Islamic Congregation, believes the true proportion of gang members who are Muslim to be around 95%. The figure far exceeds the Muslim share of the overall UK population. The overwhelmingly majority of the rape gang networks consisted entirely of men from Muslim backgrounds, predominantly of Pakistani heritage, although smaller groups from Somalia, Iran, Syria, Turkey, and other Muslim origins were also involved. The inquiry heard harrowing testimony from survivors and their families. The method used to groom children typically followed the same process. Girls as young as 11 were initially befriended by a young Muslim man who then treated the young child like an adult and would then start providing them with alcohol, drugs, and cigarettes. After a few months, the girls would then be collected from school gates, care homes, and streets in taxis. They were taken to houses, flats, restaurants, and hotels where they were raped repeatedly by groups of men, tortured, filmed for blackmail, and told they were white trash or kuffar who merited punishment. Many became pregnant while still children, some miscarried under trauma, others endured coerced abortions, and some gave birth to children who were later removed by the state. We found that the same unspeakable crimes occurred in at least 149 local authority districts. Close to 40% of all such districts across the UK, and it looks like it talks more about that at page 14. Survivors described daily rapes, red rooms of extreme torture, trafficking between cities, and institutional disbelief that compounded their suffering. Some girls were even trafficked to the Middle East where they would endure Islamic marriage. The demographic and cultural drivers are clear. Perpetrators from Pakistani Muslim and other Muslim backgrounds operated under an honor and shame-based clan code that treated non-Muslim girls, especially white working-class girls, as property available for sexual use. This pattern was reinforced by 8 theological and legal aspects of Islam. These include the doctrine of Muslim superiority drawn from Quranic verses that position Muslims at the top with a duty to correct non-believers. The gang members' justification for their crimes can be found in the Islamic principles of loyalty and disavowal known as al-wala wal-bara. I'm sure I'm not saying that right. It demands enmity towards non-Muslims, the superiority of men over women, forced marriage combined with the absence of any fixed minimum age of consent, the perception of female sexuality as inherently dangerous, a system of sex slavery that authorizes sexual relations with non-Muslim captives, and a religiously sanctioned social hierarchy that subjugates conquered non-Muslims. These elements, filtered through clannish immigrant subcultures, provided religious justification that enabled the systemic rape and even slaughter of white British girls. Were Britain functioning effectively, these girls would have received considerable state protection. However, every one of our institutions failed them catastrophically. Police forces ignored repeated reports, criminalized victims instead of perpetrators, destroyed evidence, and allowed known rapists to walk free on bail. Social care services undermined protective parents, placed children in trafficking hubs inside children's homes, closed cases despite clear indicators of exploitation, and retaliated against whistleblowers. The NHS recorded genital injuries, multiple sexual transmitted infections in children as young as 13, pregnancies caused by rape, and suicide attempts, yet discharged victims back to their abusers without safeguarding referrals or trauma care. Schools observed older men collecting girls at the gate, heard disclosures of rape on school premises, and responded by excluding victims rather than protecting them. Taxi licensing authorities renewed permits for drivers who formed the logistical backbone of the networks and collapsed in the face of organized protest when basic safety measures were proposed. Political failure lies at the heart of the scandal. Successive governments lacked the will to confront the ethnic and religious patterns. The Labour Party bears particular responsibility. It initially refused a public inquiry and only relented under pressure by ordering a process viewed with widespread skepticism. Labour dominated councils and MPs were briefed on the gangs long ago, yet later denied knowledge. The party prioritized electoral reliance on Muslim voting blocs and then blocked or watered down inquiries, suppressed ethnicity data, and framed legitimate concerns as far right agitation. When finally forced to act, the Labour government produced a national inquiry whose tightly drawn terms of reference deliberately excluded systemic examination of the demographic, cultural, and religious drivers. Systematic examination of the demographic, cultural, and religious drivers. The Conservative Party, while in government, continued with Labour's approach and failed to impose mandatory ethnicity recording or launch a full statutory inquiry despite clear evidence from Rotherham and elsewhere. Scottish political parties have refused a dedicated inquiry and failed to record offender ethnicity. Political correctness, fear of accusations of racism, and fear of losing electoral support from certain demographics have taken precedence over the protection of British children. Whistleblowers, parents, and survivors who came forward showed extraordinary courage despite having been met in the past with disbelief and intimidation. These perpetrators operated with impunity because the state enabled them. The evidence now demands immediate and decisive action to eradicate the problem, deliver justice for the victims, and ensure these abhorrent crimes are eradicated from our shores. We now have a clear sense of the problem. There are a number of measures necessary to resolve them, up to and including considerable changes to our criminal justice system, the passage of legislation aimed at targeting specifically gang-based CSE, and a great amount of institutional overhaul. And then let's go back. What is CSE again? They said it. Give me 1 second. Let me find it. CSE is child sexual exploitation. Our detailed list of recommendations includes improved data recording on ethno-religious patterns among offenders, far stronger sentencing, a comprehensive deportation effort, institutional accountability measures, multi-agency coordination, specialist training, enhanced safeguarding through greater family involvement, and closing the various gaps in British law through which so many victims fell. Following the publication of this report, we intend to release the full witness testimonies, gather additional survivor accounts, identify those responsible in Parliament, and begin civil and private legal actions to ensure maximal accountability. Next, we have an overview of the crimes. Rape gangs have exploited children systematically across every region of the United Kingdom for decades. The independent chair of the Center for Excellence for Children's Care and Protection, Alex J., has identified the 1970s as the decade when immigrant rape gangs first began tormenting the girls of Britain. However, the British Newspaper Archive reveals that the first recorded case of specifically Pakistani rape gangs dates back to 1955. When 4 Bradford-based Pakistanis were charged with raping a 15-year-old girl in Middlesbrough. This was soon after former colonial subjects from the subcontinent as much as the Caribbean became eligible to enter the UK in non-trivial numbers under the British Nationality Act 1948. What began as singular and small-scale instances became systematic and industrial over time. These horrific crimes have only escalated in recent decades, especially following Tony Blair's 1997 victory and the start of orchestrated mass immigration. With greater numbers came greater opportunities for abuse. Perpetrators built organized networks that transported victims between towns and cities and passed girls between multiple adult men. In each of these areas, the same tactics were used. Girls as young as 11 were targeted with gifts, alcohol, drugs, collected in taxis from school gates, care homes, and streets, and taken to houses, flats, restaurants, and hotels, and then raped repeatedly by groups of men, passed between perpetrators, trafficked across country lines, and in many cases impregnated or forced into abortions. Most victims endured violence, were filmed for blackmail, or told they were white trash or kuffar who deserved punishment. The authorities at entry level, including the police, social services, health services, schools, licensing bodies, and politicians, knew the patterns, possessed the intelligence, and still failed to protect the country's children. The evidence establishes that a national scandal of repeated rape, trafficking, torture, pregnancy, forced Islamic conversion, and lifelong trauma enabled by the institutional denial, political calculation, and fear of the accusation of racism took place over decades. The incidents of criminal activities listed in this report are drawn from court records, official and unofficial inquiries across the country, and witness testimony provided to the inquiry. They confirm that this was never a series of isolated local failures. It was a coordinated, nationwide pattern of organized child sexual exploitation that repeated in town after town, city after city, from the far north to the south coast. The same ethnic and religious profile of the perpetrators was documented throughout almost all of the witnesses who contracted the inquiry. The scale of the rape gang phenomenon is endemic across the entirety of Britain. The 250,000 figure originates directly from a statement in the House of Lords by Lord Pearson of Rannoch on May 14th, 2019. Do the government accept that if we extrapolate nationality, the J report on Rotherham and other reports from Telford and Oxford, there appear to have been upwards of 250,000 young white girls raped in this country, very largely by Muslim men, usually several times a day for years. So that's like a quote from some UK politician back in 2019, which is like 7 years ago, and they still haven't tackled this issue yet. He added that this number is probably an underestimate. This extrapolation now has greater support due to further data that has been collected derived from scaling the patterns documented in major inquiries. So Rotherham, the J Report 2014, at least 1,400 girls abused between 1997 and 2013, with some updated estimates exceeding this. Perpetrators were overwhelmingly Pakistani Muslim men. The Telford inquiry in 2022, more than 1,000 children, predominantly girls, over decades, again with the same perpetrators. In national footprint, the grooming gang model has been confirmed in dozens of towns and cities. Our independent inquiry, led by Rupert Lowe MP, has heard evidence demonstrating coordinated operations extending to all corners of the country and at least 149 local authority districts. See page 14 for the full map. When the Rotherham-Telford scale is applied across the documented national distribution and multiplied by the extreme underreporting factor accepted by official reviews, the total reaches the 250,000 threshold as a bare minimum. So that's a low estimate. We are far from grasping the full extent of grooming gang criminality in modern Britain. It is reasonable to assure that since sexual abuse of all kinds tends to be underreported, this is also true of grooming gangs. The Independent has reported that almost 19,000 children were identified as sexual exploitation victims in England in 1 year alone, despite the reluctance of state actors to name or tackle the problem of rape gangs. After decades of abuse, victims must number in the hundreds of thousands. The full scale is not yet known. Every major review has emphasized that recorded statistics severely understate reality. Baroness Casey National Audit on Group-Based Child Sexual Exploitation and Abuse from June 2025. The audit explicitly states that the scale, nature, and characteristics of group-based child sexual exploitation remain impossible to quantify precisely due to inconsistent data collection and historical suppression. Independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and multiple local inquiries from 2022 to 2025, it is simply not possible to know the scale because ethnicity, group offending, and historical cases were routinely unrecorded or shelved to protect community cohesion. Overleaf is a heat map that portrays the various locations in which the inquiry can be sure the rape gangs operated. It is likely that the true extent is far worse. Okay, so here we got a little map. See if I can get it in the screen. Oh, almost. Oh, here we go. So rape gangs have operated in at least 149 local authority districts across the United Kingdom. And then you have the light red is suspected, the dark red is confirmed. I believe a local authority in the UK is like a county in the US. So like this is all the places where it's taken place. And before we get into the rest of it, I'm going to take a little break, so I'll leave this map up. I'll be back in a minute and we'll continue. The scale, the tactics, the perpetrator profile, and the systemic inaction were almost always identical everywhere. Britain did not face dozens of separate local scandals. It faced one national scandal that the state allowed to grow for decades. London. London stands exposed as the epicenter of institutional denial in the grooming gang scandal. While northern towns faced public inquiries after the truth emerged, the capital maintained a wall of silence for years. The mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has repeatedly insisted there were no grooming gangs operating in the city. As our inquiry heard from Susan Hall, leader of the Conservatives in the London Assembly, the rape gang phenomenon is in fact endemic within the capital. So it looks like the mayor lied about it and said it wasn't happening in London, but it was. After challenging Khan about the presence of such gangs in London, Hall was inundated with calls from women and girls purporting to be victims of their predation. Khan describes evidence from whistleblowers as malicious and politically motivated. He told the London Assembly that the problem was far more complex than in other parts of the country and that young people were being exploited through county lines rather than organized group-based child sexual exploitation. These statements were made despite the Metropolitan Police holding reports of young girls being plied with alcohol and drugs then raped by groups of men in hotels and other locations across the capital. A Daily Express investigation revealed that Khan had direct access to HM Inspectorate of Constabulary documents detailing exactly these patterns of offending. He read the files yet continued to deny the existence of grooming gangs in public. Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp, MP, has accused Khan of facilitating a cover-up, and other politicians stated that both the mayor and the Metropolitan Police had been denying grooming gangs in London. Campaigners, including whistleblower Maggie Oliver and Chris Wilde, described the capital as the last bastion of denial and warned that the scale of the abuse there was more catastrophic than anywhere else in the country. The evidence now emerging confirms their warnings. In October 2025, the Metropolitan Police announced a review of 9,000 child sexual exploitation cases, the National Crime Agency launched Operation Beaconport to examine thousands more files nationwide after initial assessments found human errors, missed lines of inquiry, and cases wrongly dropped. London forms a significant part of this backlog. A former Metropolitan Police detective has described industrial scale child prostitution and grooming in the capital, with authorities aware but opting for inaction due to mixture of incompetence, laziness, and corruption. London has the largest Muslim population in Britain. Khan relies on significant electoral support from those communities, as well as having an ethno-religious motive to protect the public reputation of Pakistani Muslims in particular. Widespread acknowledgement of organized networks of predominantly Pakistani Muslim men targeting vulnerable white girls would have shattered the narrative of community cohesion that successive London administrations, none more than Khan's, have promoted. As for others in authority, fear of being labeled racist paralyzed the police and City Hall in the same way it did in Rotherham and Rochdale before them. One anonymous whistleblower told us that boys as well as girls are an especially vulnerable target for criminal gangs, especially Albanian, Somalian, or Turkish operating in the capital. Yet the relevant bodies still refuse to collect data on ethnicity, willfully rendering themselves blind to the very behavioral patterns that are supposed to aid law enforcement in its pursuit of justice. The Metropolitan Police review the National Crime Agency operation, and the witness accounts pouring in proof that group-based child sexual exploitation has thrived in our capital city. This inquiry records the failure without reservation. Khan and the senior leadership of the Metropolitan Police must answer for their role in this scandal. Until the capital confronts the truth with the same rigor now demanded elsewhere, the children of London remain at risk and the state remains complicit. Victim testimony. So a lot of this report is victim testimony, and they didn't even include all the victim testimony in this report. This is just like some of them. We're probably not going to read each victim testimony individually, because of course, each victim, like it's terrible what happened to each victim, but the fact that this is happening all over the country and people are being very slow to do anything about it because they're scared to be called racist, like that's the big issue here. So we'll look through a couple of these, probably read through a couple of the shorter victim testimonies, and then we'll continue with the report. Victim testimony. There are thousands of survivors who could have provided evidence to our inquiry team. Below is a summary of some of the testimony provided by our brave witnesses who spoke at the inquiry hearings. Some of the witnesses have to remain anonymous for their own safety. Inquiry panelist. Do you know how many men abused you over that period of time, if you had to guess? Chloe, one of the victims, hundreds, hundreds, and hundreds, and hundreds. Fiona, I was beaten regularly, I was drugged, filmed being raped, and the footage was distributed. I sustained broken bones, facial injuries, and severe trauma. I was subjected to racial abuse in the community and blamed by families of perpetrators. Inquiry panelist, what would you say the main issue was? Michelle, one of the victims. I don't think that they cared much about us. They didn't want to open that can of worms because it's a religion thing. I'd probably say 90%, 98% of them were Pakistani Muslim. If not, they were Iraqi or Kurdish. Whitney, my daughter told me after a while that there was a sex room in the school. I told the school about it, but they completely shut it down and said she was lying. That's crazy. Marlon, Scarlett went missing again for several days. When she was eventually found, she was unkempt, distressed, and disclosed she had been raped. Shockingly, Edge of Care staff returned her to the location where she had been raped and failed to report the offense to police or duty social workers until days later. Oh. Anna. As he left the dock to be taken down to custody, I was literally verbally assaulted by his sister who shouted Allah Akbar. Before they raped me, they would chant Bismillah Her Rahman Nur Rahim. Translation: in the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful. That's so fucked up. Jane, I later learned that key records from the children's home were missing or destroyed. Despite statutory retention requirements, my care file from that placement cannot be produced. This has obstructed accountability. They would toot the horn of the car, and then a child would be taken to the front door by a staff member of the children's home. If I got raped tomorrow, I would never come back to the police again because what is the point? It's just a pointless process that leaves you feeling even worse because you're either not believed or you're not taken seriously or they don't use the tools that they've got to investigate properly because it's too hard. The local mosque where the boyfriend used to go is known for extreme radical views, and I feel that the children and young adults that are attending that mosque are being taught what to go out and do in the community and to our children at schools to preach. I'd had friends that were Muslim, girlfriends, and this never happened to them. They would be in the cars with us sometimes, but the men would treat them differently. They have no compassion for the young girls that are out on the streets, and they see us as slags, as white trash, English pig dogs. Came up a lot. Muslims don't like pigs and they don't like dogs, so they hate dogs, they hate pigs, and they'd put women on on the same level as that. Comments were constantly made suggesting that white girls and Christian girls were viewed as having fewer morals or lower value, whereas Muslim girls were described by some of the men as having dignity and higher moral standing. These comparisons were used to justify the way I was treated and to further humiliate and control me. I was also subjected to religiously charged comments designed to shame and dehumanize me, including statements implying that God had abandoned me or would reject me because of what had been done to me. Here we can read some of these ones. This is like a shorter. This is a shorter whistleblower testimony from a social worker. Let's read through this one. Our whistleblower social worker is an experienced child social care professional with nearly 4 decades of service. Her specialist work focused on leaving care services and safeguarding highly vulnerable young people. In February 2018, she raised extensive whistleblowing disclosures concerning financial abuse of young people, misuse of public funds, unlawful sanctions, illegal evictions, racism towards children in care, and systemic failures to safeguard against sexual and criminal exploitation. She was assured that a comprehensive investigation would occur. In that event, responses were delayed, fragmented, or opaque. Senior officers later acknowledged that financial abuse was likely but claimed proof was impossible due to missing records. She was informed that shredders had been purchased at units and that records may have been destroyed. Despite this, the disclosure was deemed reviewed without her ever having been interviewed. She describes repeated safeguarding failures witnessed while she was interim co-manager of semi-independent units, including children with severe mental health needs placed on safely repeated missing episodes, untreated exploitation risks, and delayed police or mental health intervention. Her evidence illustrates escalating harm, including self harm, sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, and unlawful housing practices. After raising these concerns, she experienced retaliation, including removal of payments, suspension based on unfounded allegations, and professional isolation. Senior leadership and elected members repeatedly failed to engage meaningfully with her concerns. She concludes that the local council prioritized reputational and financial considerations over child safety, leaving ongoing risks unaddressed. And then that's all we got for the testimony. Next, we have demographics and culture. Again, we're going to take this another 1 minute break and then we'll continue. All right, demographics and culture. Perpetrators from Pakistani Muslim and other Muslim backgrounds formed the core of the rape gangs nationwide. They operated under an honor and shame clan code that treated non-Muslim girls, especially white working class girls, as property available for sexual use because these girls had no male protectors who could retaliate. The men began by showering the girls with attention, gifts, alcohol, and drugs. This then escalated to coercion, gang rape, and trafficking. They transported victims across towns, shared them with friends and family, and sometimes forced conversions to Islam, followed by religious marriages. The Muslim men justified the abuse by describing white British girls as easy trash or morally inferior. The same networks targeted Sikh girls until Sikh communities mobilized collective male protection and forced the gangs to withdraw. British girls were not permitted such a defense. This religiously framed exploitation was repeated in every major town and city and beyond. Britain has seen a series of high-profile convictions for organized group-based child sexual exploitation, commonly referenced to as grooming gangs. However, the number of convictions amount only to a small proportion of the men who carried out the crimes. In cases where perpetrators of Pakistani heritage were named publicly in court records or reports, their names have consistently been Muslim in character. According to the 2021 census for England and Wales, around 93% of individuals identifying as Pakistani by ethnicity also identified as Muslim, with only about 1% following another religion, the remainder having no faith recorded. Researcher Peter McLaughlin in Easy Meat 2016 compiled a comprehensive list of grooming gang convictions from 1997 to 2018 with updates and subsequent analysis, drawing from published court outcomes. His examination of names indicated that approximately 87% of those convicted bore distinctively Muslim names, which was a figure echoed in related analysis, far exceeding the Muslim proportion, around 6% of the general population of Britain. The majority of these convicted groups consisted entirely of men from Muslim backgrounds. These groups are predominantly of Pakistani heritage, especially when the group exceeds 10 or more members. The larger group size dynamic of Pakistani perpetrators is on display in major prosecutions and official reviews from locations such as Rockdale, Rotherham, Huddersfield, Oxford, Telford, and others. Other convictions have involved groups primarily composed of Muslims from non-Pakistani origins, demonstrating that the issue is not necessarily confined to one ethnic group. Two Somali origin gangs in Bristol, a mainly African heritage gang in Banbury, three Iranians in Chelmsford, three Syrians and one Kuwaiti in Newcastle, two Turkish men in Somerset, a Romanian rape gang in Rotherham, a large Newcastle Operation Sanctuary case involving 17 men and one woman from diverse Muslim backgrounds, Albanian, Kurdish, Bangladeshi, Indian, Turkish, Iranian, Pakistani, Iraqi, and Eastern European heritage. Nearly all published names were Islamic. These patterns are drawn from judicial proceedings, sentencing records, official inquiries such as those into Rotherham, Rockdale, and others, and public reporting on concluded cases. Recent developments, including ongoing reviews and data audits from national audits and reopened historic cases, continue to examine the scale, characteristics, and patterns of such offending. With regard to the scale of the crimes, this is reflected in conviction records, police data from relevant force areas, and audits, all of which note overrepresentation of South Asian Pakistani heritage men in certain group-based cases while acknowledging data limitations on ethnicity nationwide. Smaller, non-Muslim groups often feature different dynamics or victim profiles compared with the classic multi-offender grooming model in larger operations. The term Asian has frequently been applied in media, official statements, and public discourse to describe the perpetrators in grooming gang cases across Britain. This broad labeling can be misleading, however, because Britain hosts a substantial number of non-Muslim Asian populations, such as Hindus and Sikhs from India, Buddhists from Japan, and Christians from the Philippines and Vietnam. These populations have, with only very rare exceptions, had no involvement in these offenses. In fact, members of these communities have often appeared as victims than as perpetrators in the grooming gang cases that have come to light. Dr. Ella Hill, a supervisor of the Rotherham grooming gangs and now a qualified doctor, has courageously shared her experiences and reflections in multiple public forums, including testimony to the 2022 J inquiry, a July 2020 podcast interview, and a 2018 article in The Independent. Her report is entirely consistent with the evidence that was heard at the rape gang inquiry. Following years of repeated sexual violence, severe beatings, and attempted murder by her abusers, her family members were forced to change their surnames and relocate to another part of the country so that she could complete her schooling and later pursue and obtain a medical degree. In her accounts, Dr. Hill has consistently described the abuse as being both racially and religiously aggravated. She was explicitly told during the rapes that the attacks were happening because she was white and because she was Christian. She explained that she was initially groomed and then trafficked by a Pakistani Muslim boyfriend to groups of Muslim men. She was repeatedly taken to various houses and flats where she was raped, physically assaulted, and tortured. Even after she tried to escape and hide, her main perpetrator tracked her down, broke into her home, and attempted to kill her on 5 separate occasions. She survived these attacks but was left with extensive lacerations and bruising. On at least 5 occasions, she approached the police presenting medical evidence of her injuries. Yet each time she was told there was nothing they could do and her evidence was not accepted. Dr. Hill was emphasized that the verbal abuse she endured was saturated with both racial and religious slurs. While being beaten, she was repeatedly called a white slag, a white whore, a white cunt, simultaneously condemned as a non-Muslim who deserved punishment for failing to follow Islamic rules. Her abusers, she said, operating according to what she termed grooming gang ideology, under which they believed their crimes were religiously justified. In fuller detail, in her submission incorporated into Associate Professor Lisa Oakley's evidence to the 2022 J inquiry, Dr. Hill stated, I was told that I must respect their religion. This was the first of many confusing lies that I was forced to believe. I was told to show them, Muslims, respect. I mustn't eat pork. I was told that Muslim girls are good and pure and stay virgins till marry, but all white girls are slags and they all sleep with hundreds of people. I was told white girls are trash. They are all whores. They are lower than shit under your shoe. They don't obey Allah, so they deserve to be punished. They don't dress modestly. Muslim women are pure because they cover down to their ankles and down to their wrists, and then hem off the top, and the hem of their top comes down below their knees. White girls show the curves of their body, so they are asking for it. They should be raped as punishment for not obeying Allah. Kafir, non-Muslim girls are worthless. Sex with a kafir girl doesn't count as adultery. Only sex with a Muslim woman counts. If you're not a virgin before marriage, you should be beaten. Many times I was told that the Quran says, if one of your wives disobeys you, beat her. This was often quoted to me before they beat me with their hands. They believed they had a position of religious moral superiority over non-believers. They believed it was their duty to punish us, as they believed that doing so made them good Muslims. This is what they were taught by their mothers. They were taught that witches in Pakistan are blonde, so blondes are more evil, and they deserve worse punishment. I was told that in Islam, if a girl or a woman looks at a man who isn't her brother, father, or husband, then that means she wants to have sex with him. So I was told to look at the floor when I was around Muslim men. So when I did look at a waiter in a restaurant, I was then taken away to be gang raped as punishment. I was told that according to their faith community, girls are old enough for sex when they start their periods at age 11. Many of us had to endure the sexual act of thighing, which I'm now told is a religiously sanctioned way of molesting children according to some Islamic scriptures. Oh, they basically have sex with your legs. It's like a leg type thing. It says it here. It's like a loophole. So if you're a child and you haven't had your period yet, this is like the loophole that these rapists use to still have sex with you or rape you. I was beaten, strangled, suffocated, and my head held underwater, tortured, kicked, and raped over 100 times. I was told that if you don't scream when you're raped, then you're consenting to the rape, so you should be stoned to death. I was told that Muslim girls know this because the Quran says that Aisha's silence was her consent to the marriage to Muhammad. So Muslim girls know to scream, but white girls don't. So that's their fault then because they're not Muslim. When I did wear a headscarf to try to protect myself from being raped, I was told to get it off and they raped me again. I now know that all these so-called ways to protect yourself from being raped are rape myths used to excuse perpetrators' criminal behavior. They threatened to kill my parents and my parents tried to stop me seeing them. I was intimidated with guns and threatened with body parts being cut off with knives. When I tried to escape, I was told that I had offended their honor, so they had to spill my blood. They did this as an honor attack. All of the sexual abuse that I experienced was linked to spiritual abuse or religious abuse. Religious scriptures were used as tools of control to force me to conform to their will. I was not allowed to question these religious beliefs. They used their religious moral authority and self-proclaimed elitism to control me through use of scripture, forced confessions, censorship of decision-making, requirement of secrecy and silence, isolation, excessive shaming and punishment around sexuality, and requiring unquestioning obedience. I experienced this as a deeply personal, terrifying physical, emotional and spiritual attack. Every time they quoted scripture, it was very hard to argue with. To them, it was like I was arguing with God. To me, it was actually like I was arguing with the devil. They used their so-called religious moral authority to do the most horrific, immoral acts imaginable. The entirely typical experiences of survivors known as Sarah and Anna, both of whom were helped by Christian Legal Center, provide further illustrations of the religious elements reported in some grooming gang cases. Sarah endured a 12-year ordeal after being kidnapped from the street at the age of 15. During this period, she was repeatedly drugged with Valium, beaten, and raped. At one point, her abuser presented her with a certificate from the mosque and declared that they were married according to Islamic rites. Later, he divorced her under Shira procedure simply by stating, "I divorce you 3 times." She was then immediately married in a ceremony conducted by an imam to a man she did not know. Within minutes of the ceremony ending, while the wedding party continued downstairs, she was raped by her new husband. Over the years, Sarah was subjected to 8 forced abortions, one of them 5 months into pregnancy. When she accompanied her abuser to medical appointments, he required her to wear a hijab and walk 5 feet behind him. She was compelled to learn the Quran in Arabic and permitted to speak only Urdu and Punjabi. She was also made to cook and clean for the gang members who abused her. Sarah made several unsuccessful attempts to escape. On one occasion, after she reported her kidnapping to the police, she was interviewed by a Muslim officer who switched off the tape recorder and instructed her to drop her allegations because of lack of evidence. She later learned that this officer was imprisoned for child sex offenses. That's like the scariest thing is like you're like kidnapped and you call the policeman shows up and he's like one of the kidnappers. That's like a horror movie. In a separate case, Anna was living in a children's home in Bradford in 2002. From the age of 13, she was raped and abused while in the home, and at 15, she was forced into a Shira marriage. Her social worker attended the marriage ceremony and permitted her husband's parents to foster her after she became pregnant. The parents received a fostering allowance from the state. Anna described her situation as one of domestic slavery in which she was treated like a maid and repeatedly sexually abused by dozens of men. In Britain, reports from the Metropolitan Police in London alone have indicated an average of 1,125 sexual assaults per year involving unlicensed taxi drivers. A significant proportion of the offenders in these cases have been identified as Muslim. A further form of sexual exploitation associated with certain Muslim communities across Britain is marriage trafficking. The Forced Marriage Unit handled 800 cases in 2024 concerning girls and women residents in the country who were forced into marriage with men, providing direct support in 229 of those instances. Among the 280 cases where the focus country was recorded in 2023, the 6 countries accounting for the highest numbers were Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, India, Somalia, and Nigeria. Of these 6, all except India and Nigeria have overwhelmingly Muslim populations. Earlier Home Office figures from 2009 showed that 90% of forced marriage victims in Britain were Muslim. In more recent years, however, the FMU has ceased collecting or publishing data on the religion of those involved, a shift that echoes patterns of avoidance seen during the grooming gang investigations. An FMU report stated, "Forced marriage is not a problem specific to one country, religion, or culture. The FMU does not record data on religion. No major faith in the UK advocates forced marriage. Freely given consent is a prerequisite of Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, and Sikh marriages. Although forced marriages occur in various communities and is not unique to Muslims, statistics show a clear overrepresentation of Muslims among those involved in forced marriage cases. It is also inaccurate to claim that Islam mandates a woman's consent for marriage." Similar patterns of sexual offenses disproportionately involving Muslim men have been reported in other Western countries with significant Muslim immigration populations. In the Netherlands, considerable media coverage is focused on so-called lover boys, who are predominantly Moroccan Muslim men. These individuals first seduce Dutch girls, often teenagers, and then coerce them into prostitution in order to profit from their earnings. According to a 2001 report by the Amsterdam-based child rights organization, approximately 5,000 ordinary Dutch schoolgirls aged 13 or 14 from typical family backgrounds had been lured into prostitution by lover boys. The documentary film Lover Boys, directed by Julia Rook, follows the work of Ibrahim, a Dutch Moroccan social worker supporting both the perpetrators and their victims. Wow. In Sweden, a 2021 academic study examining Swedish rape offenders concluded that nearly half of the convicted individuals were born outside Sweden, when immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa being markedly overrepresented among them. In Australia, sorry, one sec. In Australia, 9 Lebanese men were convicted in 2002 of gang raping white girls. Contemporary media reports at the time indicated that police were aware of over 60 female victims linked to the group. Through the convictions related to the rape of 7 girls, police seized a mobile phone message from one of the perpetrators that read, "When you are feeling down, bash a Christian or Catholic and lift up." Statistics. Offending data from the 2017 Quilliam Foundation analysis, together with recent independent investigations, reveal a consistent, disproportionate involvement of Muslim men, overwhelmingly of Pakistani heritage, in group-based CSE. The 250,000 figure is not a precise count. No such count exists because the British state has failed to record it, but we may regard it as a conservative estimate that accounts for the organized, repeated nature of the abuse. Many girls raped hundreds of times by multiple perpetrators in decades of institutional concealment. Analysis of 264 convictions for group-based child sexual exploitation from 2005 to 2017 found that 84% of offenders were South Asian, with the vast majority Pakistani Muslim. Only 7% were white and 8% were black. Additional context from expert commentary includes statements by Dr. Taj Hajri and Aman at the Oxford Islamic Congregation, who observed that virtually every individual in these grooming gangs appeared to be Muslim, estimating that 95% of those involved are of Muslim faith. As previously stated, Peter McLaughlin's research indicates that approximately 87% of rape gang convictions were of people with distinctively Muslim names. These figures stand in marked contrast to the much smaller proportion of Pakistani or Muslim communities within the overall population of modern Britain. Muslims approximately 6.5% and Pakistanis around 2.1%, according to the most recent census data. Multiple examinations, including police data from various forces, national audits, and independent reviews, have documented this overrepresentation in group-based offending of this nature, even as some earlier official narratives emphasized no single community profile or sought to downplay ethnic patterns. The number of reported rapes in the UK has risen substantially since 1997, when the era of large-scale mass immigration into the country commenced under Blair. Official police recorded crime data from England and Wales indicate that rape offenses stood at approximately 8,500 in the year 2000, a figure closely aligned with levels observed in the late 1990s prior to major changes in recording practices. By the year ending March 2025, police recorded that rape offenses had increased to over 70,000, according to figures published by the Office for National Statistics, reflecting a rise exceeding 800%, even after accounting for population growth of around 15% during the intervening years. In stark contrast, Poland, which maintained relatively low levels of immigration throughout the same period, has experienced a decline in reported rapes. Polish National Police data show 2,399 recorded rape offenses in 2000, falling to 1,127 in 2023, a reduction of more than 50%. With a stable population of approximately 38 million, this equates to a per capita rate of around 3 rapes per 100,000 residents in recent years, compared to over 100 rapes per 100,000 in the UK. So basically, the UK does have a rape problem, looking at the statistics here, and it's because they're importing these Pakistani Muslims. These comparative patterns drawn from official sources highlight divergent trends between the two nations. References include the ONS Bulletin on Sexual Offences in England and Wales for the year ending March 2025, the Home Office Historical Police Recorded Crime Tables, and Eurostat Police Recorded Offences data alongside Polish national statistics compiled via Statista for the period covering 2000 to 2023. Per capita calculations further underscore the scale of disparity when relative population sizes are considered. These figures indicate that the rape gangs are a specific ethno-religious phenomenon, with Muslims, especially Pakistani Muslims, significantly overrepresented. Next, it's going to get into the influence of Islam, Muslim treatment of non-Muslims worldwide. We're going to take like another 1 minute break and then we'll get into this. We're just taking a break for a minute here, but we're gonna um get back to it. All right, we're back. So I was reading through this one a minute ago. Um, it's fine. Everything in here you can say on YouTube, but it is like some of the shit that like these social workers do, these Muslim social workers, like they don't report when children claim that they were like raped or abused because the Muslim social workers, if they're Muslim in the UK, don't want to face backlash from their Muslim community, so they're not doing their job as like mandated reporters. It was like really honestly, it was really frustrating to read, but we'll get through it. So, the influence of Islam, Muslim treatment of non-Muslims worldwide. Britain is not a unique case. This sort of thing goes on everywhere that either welcomes mass migration from Muslim countries or contains long established Muslim populations. There is a consistent pattern of sexual violence directed against non Muslim minorities in settings where Muslims form the majority. Across Britain, as we have noted, girls from Sikh and Hindu backgrounds have also been targeted by Muslim gangs. Unlike the white British majority, these non Muslim immigrant populations were never prevented from organizing as a collective to protect their own. In doing so, as was their duty, the network of Sikh organizations drew attention to the appalling treatment of non Muslims in Pakistan. In 2024, UN human rights experts expressed serious alarm regarding the vulnerability of minority girls in Pakistan to forced religious conversions and forced marriages. Their press release highlighted that Christian and Hindu girls in particular face heightened risks of abduction, trafficking, child forced marriage, domestic servitude, and sexual violence. Human rights groups and media reports, including a 2021 BBC investigation, have estimated that thousands of non Muslim girls, primarily Christians, Hindus, and Sikhs, are abducted annually in Pakistan, forced to convert to Islam, and forced into marriage with their abductors. One case involved Farah, a 12-year-old Christian girl, abducted from her home in 2020 by three Muslim men, raped, and forced to perform household labor as a slave. A common sequence in these cases sees a girl abducted, coerced into signing a conversion certificate, and swiftly married to a Muslim man. Police in Pakistan frequently side with the abductors over the girl's family. When parents take legal action, courts tend to uphold the legitimacy of the conversion. British certificates may be falsified to indicate that the girl is not a minor. Contact with her family is typically blocked. Following conversion to Islam, non-Muslim parents lose all authority over their child, as Islamic law prohibits non-Muslims from exercising guardianship over Muslims, including their own offspring. The evidence from grooming gang convictions across Britain repeatedly shows a Muslim background among many of the perpetrators. When this is viewed alongside similar patterns of sex crimes observed both in countries of origin for immigrants and in Muslim-majority societies, it offers compelling grounds to consider that elements of Islam are contributing to the grooming gang scourge in our country. While it is unsurprising that a religion can shape and regulate sexual behavior, the suggestion that Islam might play a role in driving sex crimes remains deeply uncomfortable for some of the liberal West. Even so, the possibility of an Islamic influence on these crimes cannot be dismissed. The available data strongly points towards it as a hypothesis that merits serious examination. So the report, the Rape Gang Inquiry Report, is saying you have to consider the fact that the it's the people's religion, the perpetrator's religion that's causing the spike in rapes in the UK. And it's like everyone already knows that. But this is like a real government report, so they're playing it safe. They're saying, hey, we should look into it. The impact of any religion on individual behavior is rarely direct and unmediated. It is heavily filtered through culture, which a religion can gradually reshape over generations. Not all Muslim communities or societies are influenced by Islam to the same degree or in the same manner. Minority Muslim populations may behave differently from majority ones. For instance, convictions of Indian origin Muslim men in grooming gang cases across Britain are notably rare compared with those of Pakistani heritage. The disparity may relate to a demographic context. Muslims form only about 14% of India's population, placing them in a minority position where social and legal constraints differ markedly from Pakistan, where Muslims dominate overwhelmingly and non-Muslims constitute a small, often marginalized community. In such a setting, exploiting non-Muslim neighbors becomes far easier. At least 8 theological aspects of Islam may contribute to cultural patterns that enable or normalize the sexual abuse of non-Muslim girls. These include the doctrine of Muslim superiority, the principle of loyalty of disavowal, male dominance over women, enforced seclusion and veiling of women, forced marriage combined with the absence of a fixed minimum age of consent, the perception of female sexuality as inherently dangerous, the historical Shia institutions of slavery, and the system of dimitude. These are all rooted in classical Islamic ideology up to and including Islamic jurisprudence, but even in Shia governed nations, adaptations are common, such as setting a minimum marriage age or restricting unilateral divorce by men in order to lessen the harsher effects on women. Muslim superiority. Islam holds that those who are righteous and truly fear God, meaning Muslims, are inherently superior to those who reject God's command, namely non-Muslims. This idea is captured in the Quran. You Muslims are the best nation, raised up for humankind, commanding what is good and forbidding what is wrong, and believing in Allah. If only the people of the book, i.e. Christians and Jews, believed, it would be better for them. Some among them are believers, but most are perverted. The verse positions Muslims as the finest community, entrusted by God with the duty to enjoin good and prohibit evil. These responsibilities can be understood as authorizing Muslims to correct, compel, or if needed, punish non-Muslims. Potentially through coercion or force, other Quranic passages affirm Islam's ultimate supremacy over all religions. It is He, Allah, who has sent His messenger with the guidance and the religion of truth, Islam, to make it triumph over every religion. Non-Muslims who refuse Islam are described in harsh terms. Surely the worst of animals in Allah's sight are rejectors of Islam. They do not believe. The concept of Muslim superiority is closely linked to derogatory views of non-Muslims. For instance, this quote here, Shura 928, labels associators, a pejorative term encompassing Christians, Jews, and other non-Muslims, as unclean or najis. These teachings can provide a religious justification that bolsters an abuser's conviction of their own superiority and facilitates the dehumanization of non-Muslim victims. In her July 2020 podcast interview, Rotherham survivor Dr. Ella Hill described abusive language and acts that embodied the sense of superiority. She recounted being made to bend down and kiss the perpetrator's feet as a deliberate act to underscore her inferiority. She also spoke of another Rotherham victim who, during gang rapes by dozens of men, was forced to lick their feet clean because they believed that they were morally superior to her. A quote from Hill, one of the victims: "It's a Muslim superiority thing. They believe that they have maximum moral authority to command the people beneath them to lick their feet." She further noted that her rapist viewed non-Muslim habits as inherently impure. If you're eating pork, you're unclean, you're dirty. If you use a knife and fork, you're dirty. If you don't eat food with your hands. Which, like, to any other person that's, like, not Pakistani Muslims is, like, backwards. So it's like, you would think to be clean, you would use a knife and a fork. But to these people, these, like, rapists, the Muslim rape gangs, you're clean if you use a knife and fork. You should eat with your hands, which sounds just backwards. Us and them mindset. The Islamic principle known as al-wala wal-bara, loyalty and disavowal, commands Muslims to direct their love and allegiance towards what pleases God while hating, avoiding, and distancing themselves from what displeases Him. In essence, it calls for loving and supporting fellow believers and rejecting non-believers. This teaching draws on several verses, including, "Let not the believers take the disbelievers as allies rather than of believers. Whoever does that has nothing from God unless you guard yourself as a precaution. You who believe, do not take the Jews and Christians as allies. They are allies of each other. Whoever of you takes them as allies is already one of them. Surely God does not guide the people who are evildoers. Yet you see those in whose hearts is a sickness. They are quick to turn to them. Whoever takes God as an ally and his messenger Muhammad, and those who believe Muslims, surely the party of God, they are the victors. There was a good example for you in Abraham and those who were with him when they said to their people, surely we are quit of you and what you serve instead of God. We repudiate you, and between us and you, enmity has appeared and hatred forever until you believe in God alone." These passages emphasize that Muslims should maintain strong bonds within the community while keeping non-Muslims at a distance and harboring enmity toward them. The Quran warns that God views non-Muslims with contempt and that Muslims who befriend, ally with, or associate closely with them risk being regarded by God as disbelievers themselves. While some Muslims downplay this doctrine, revivalist movements, which have gained considerable influence in Western countries, have actively promoted it, presenting strict adherence to loyalty and disavowal as vital for the Muslim community's success in carrying out its divine mission. Beyond its theological role, al-wala wal-bara has profoundly shaped certain Islamic cultures. In such environments, many Muslims feel strong pressure not to say or do anything that could damage the image of the Muslim community or bring discredit to Islam. Within an honor and shame-based framework reinforced by these values, speaking out to outsiders about wrongdoing committed by fellow Muslims is often seen as an act of betrayal. This dynamic can have serious real-world consequences. For example, in the book, the Imam's daughter, Hanan, later known as Hannah, described her experience as a 14 or 15-year-old Pakistani teenager in Britain. After confiding in a female teacher that her father was beating her, the teacher informed the deputy head, who arranged for a male Pakistani Muslim social worker to meet with her at school. Initially terrified because of his background, Hanan eventually opened up to him about being treated as a domestic servant, fearing a forced marriage, and enduring physical abuse. That same afternoon, she returned home to find the social worker speaking with her father and relaying everything she had said. While the social worker was present, her father acted kindly, but once he left, her father subjected her to a severe beating and rape, threatened to kill her if she ever spoke again, and imprisoned her in the cellar for days. When Hanan later encountered the social worker at school and refused further contact, he reportedly told her, "Hey, I was just doing what I thought was right. You know that. It's not right to betray your community." And that's kind of what I was talking about before we started this little section, is you have a mandated reporter in the UK, except he's Muslim. So he doesn't want to report a crime committed by a Muslim, like the girl's father that was raping her, because it will make the Muslim community look bad. So you basically have someone that can't do their job because of their religious beliefs, which is a systemic issue. I mean, it looks to be systemic in the UK at least. And it's not just like Muslim people that work for the government. It's also like everybody else that's scared to be called racist or Islamophobic if they report these crimes. Similar patterns have appeared in accounts from grooming gang survivors. Some have described described approaching the police only to be interviewed by Muslim officers who switched off the recording device and urged her to abandon her complaint due to supposed lack of evidence. A deeply ingrained culture of enforced loyalty and community protection can discourage individuals from reporting abuses or providing evidence against members of their own group. Had the social worker in Haman's case reported her disclosures to the police, leading to her father facing criminal charges, he would have exposed himself and by extension those associated with him to the serious risk of being labeled a traitor within the Muslim community. The prominent Indian Pakistani Muslim thinker and revivalist Abul Ala Maududi, in his influential work Let Us Be Muslim, maintained that Muslims cannot achieve true success until their highest allegiance is given to God in the Muslim Ummah community. The doctrine of loyalty and disavowal exerts particularly strong pressure when Muslims live as a minority in non-Muslim host countries. In such settings, as they seek to preserve and assert a powerful collective identity, Muslims may place even greater emphasis on internal solidarity and separation from non-believers than they would in their countries of origin. Okay, that's all the... We're finally caught up now. So next, it's going to be superiority and dominance of men over women. I need to go get some water, so I need like just a 1 minute break. This is like a lot of talking, a lot of like reading this. It dries out my mouth. I'll be right back. Okay, we are back. So next is superiority and dominance of men over women. If you're just tuning in, this is the rape gang inquiry in the UK that was released by Rupert Lowe, who's like some conservative politician in the UK. So superiority and dominance of men over women. Islam establishes that men hold the position of managers or maintainers over women, as stated in this quote here, Surah 434 in the Quran, where the role involves ensuring women remain in their proper state. Under Islamic law, every woman remains under guardianship of a male relative. Normally, this is her father. Should the father be unable to serve due to death, loss of mental capacity, or apostasy from Islam, a specified order of male relatives from the paternal line steps in, starting with the grandfather, then sons, brothers, nephews, and uncles. The Quran further authorizes men to discipline their wives, including through physical violence. Numerous authoritative sources and Sharia regulations reinforce the notion of women's inferiority to men. The Quran declares that men hold a rank above women. The Prophet Muhammad stated that women are deficient in both religion and intelligence relative to men, and in the same hadith he noted that women form the majority of those in hell. He also taught that if a woman or a dog passes in front of a praying man, the prayer is invalidated. A reason mosques position men with their backs to women during prayer. Sharia obliges a wife to be engaged in sexual intercourse with her husband whenever he desires it. If she refuses, Muhammad said the angels will curse her until morning. Divorce under Sharia strongly favors men. A husband may unilaterally divorce his wife without stating a reason, simply by pronouncing "I divorce you" 3 times. For a wife, obtaining a divorce is far more difficult. typically involving a formal legal process and often a financial cost. Following divorce, the mother may retain physical custody of young children up to a particular age, but the father retains legal guardianship. Moreover, if the mother remarries, she loses the right to have children from a previous marriage reside with her. Shira rules on evidence further diminish woman's status, valuing a woman's testimony at half that of a man's. Inheritance laws under Shira generally allocate women half the share given to men. For example, a son receives twice the portion of a daughter. A wife or wives together inherit 1/4 of a husband's estate if he leaves no children, or 1/8 if he does leave children. In contrast, a husband inherits half of his wife's estate if she has no children, or 1/4 if she does. Shira's approach to rape also disadvantages women. Rape is categorized as a form of zina, illicit sexual intercourse, the same offense that covers adultery and fornication. Zina is defined as sexual intercourse between a man and a woman who is neither his wife nor his slave. There is no distinct offense of rape. It is treated as a coerced zina. A marital rape is not recognized. The penalty for the rapist mirrors that for consensual extramarital sex: 100 lashings for an unmarried person, or stoning to death for one who is or has been married. When a woman accuses a man of rape, her consent is presumed unless both the act of penetration and her lack of consent are proven by 4 male eyewitnesses who each directly observed the man's penis entering the woman's vagina. Naturally, the presence of 4 men witnessing a rape without intervening makes it highly improbable they would testify in the victim's favor. Should a woman allege rape but fail to produce the 4 required male witnesses, she risks being convicted of zina on the basis of her own accusation. In 2003, Pakistan's National Commission on the Status of Women reported that up to 88% of women in prison in Pakistan were rape or gang rape victims unable to meet the 4-witness requirement, or instead convicted of illicit sex. Taken together, these Shira provisions that institutionalize male dominance over women exert a profound influence. In cultures shaped by Islam, boys can be raised to grow into men who assume rightful control over the woman in their lives, confident in their inherent superiority. The seclusion of women. Islamic law contains multiple provisions that mandate the covering and seclusion of women. It is widely recognized that a Muslim woman must cover most of her body when appearing in public. Additionally, Shira grants a male guardian the authority to restrict a girl's or a woman's movements, allowing him to confine a wife or daughter to the home and permit her to leave only when accompanied by a male relative and for a valid reason. This is reflected in Surah 33:33, which instructs women, "Stay in your houses and do not flaunt yourselves." One consequence of the Shira-derived culture of covering and seclusion is that a woman who appears in public without covering or remains outside the protected square of the home may be culturally perceived as unguarded and therefore sexually available or promiscuous. This notion that an uncovered woman invites molestation is suggested in Surah 33:59 of the Quran, where Muhammad is instructed that his wives and daughters should cover themselves so they are not ashamed. Certain Islamic preachers have explicitly endorsed this view, following the high-profile convictions of Muslim men of Lebanese background for rape in Sydney, Australia. The country's Grand Mufti, Sheikh Taj al-Din al-Hilali, controversially placed blame on the victims for not being covered and not remaining in their homes. He stated, "If you take out uncovered meat and place it outside without cover, and the cat comes to eat it, whose fault is it, the cat or the uncovered meats? The uncovered meat is the problem. If she was in her home, in her hijab, no problem would have occurred." In making these remarks, he was presenting Islamic norms as the remedy to crimes of the kind committed by rape gangs. According to this perspective, if individuals adopted Islam and adhered to its rules, women and girls would be protected from such abuses because they would be kept secluded, placed under permanent male supervision, and rendered invisible to outsiders. Forced marriage and age of consent. Under Shira, marriage takes the form of a contract arranged between two men, the groom and the bride's male guardian. The structure closely resembles a contract of sale. The groom pays an agreed sum known as the mahr. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. To the bride, and in exchange she becomes sexually available to him. Islamic jurisprudence sets no minimum age at which a girl or a woman may be married. Religious authorities permit a father to arrange a marriage for his daughter even while she is still an infant. The Prophet Muhammad himself marries Aisha when she was 6, an arrangement made between Muhammad and her father, and consummated the marriage when she was 9. The Quran itself addressed the remarriage of a divorced girl who has not yet reached menstruation. Shira distinguishes between types of guardians. The bride's father or paternal grandfather is termed as Wali Majber, forcing guardian, because certain schools of Islamic law allow him to compel a virgin daughter or granddaughter into marriage without her consent. The notion that a girl must reach a particular age before she can consent to sexual activity is foreign to Islam. In Islamic teaching, the only lawful context for a woman to consent to sex is through marriage, and even that consent is not always required. Significantly, the Arabic term nikah denotes both marriage and sexual intercourse. Shira, in effect, merges the two concepts. An unmarried woman is forbidden from engaging in sex, while a married woman has no right under Shira to refuse sexual relations with her husband. Hadiths further state that a virgin's silence constitutes consent to marriage. This merging of consent to marriage and consent to sex sheds light on Dr. Hill's account that a rapist interpreted their victim's silence as consent to the rape, drawing on these same hadiths. Islamic scholars differ on the degree of physical or emotional maturity needed for sexual intercourse within marriage. Some hold that the onset of puberty serves as the threshold for readiness, although Muhammad consummated his marriage with the 9-year-old Aisha before she reached puberty, and others permit thighing, intercrural sex, with a wife who is menstruating or considered too young for vaginal penetration. This practice Dr. Hill also described. These observations suggest that Muslim grooming gangs may exhibit religious and cultural indifference to the modern concept of an age of consent. In an interview, Andrew Norfolk, one of the first journalists to expose Britain's rape gang scandal, stated that although Islam prohibits sex outside marriage, all 4 schools of Islam jurisprudence teach that a girl can be married when she reaches puberty, which on average in Britain is 11. When the Muslim Brotherhood government took power in Egypt, one of the new laws they were going to introduce was to lower the age of consent from 18 to 13, and disappointment was voiced by certain Salafs and Muslim Brotherhood scholars that it wasn't 9. Islamic State had 9 as the permissible age for marriage. I don't think there's a same sense of wrongness and shame in some cases about having sex with a 12-year-old girl. Next, we got female sexuality. Islamic canonical. Canonical. I gotta Google this one.
Canonical.
Canonical. Islamic canonical sources portray women as possessing sexual desires that are at least as strong as men's, if not stronger, and view these desires as potentially harmful to men. The Prophet Muhammad stated, "After me, I have not left any trial more severe to men than women." The Arabic term fitna used here denotes a severe trial that can involve seduction or temptation leading people astray from faith, and also carries connotations of chaos that disrupts social harmony. Muhammad further suggests that men are susceptible to sexual temptation, explaining that Allah has preordained a portion of zina, unlawful. Oh. Here, 1 second. I'm having stream issues. We are taking an IT break right now, just to make sure everything's running properly. Temptation, explaining. Okay, it looks like we're good. Stream just went down for a second. I think we're good. Where was I? Muhammad further suggested that men are susceptible to sexual temptation, explaining that Allah has preordained a portion of zina, unlawful sexual intercourse, for every man. Allah has written for the son of Adam his inevitable share of zina, whether he is aware of it or not. So I believe that's saying that if you're a Muslim man, your God says that it's okay if you have some sexual temptation. It's inevitable for men to have sexual temptation, I guess. One practical expression of anxiety over women's sexuality is the practice of female genital mutilation, which various schools of Islamic law either require or strongly recommend as a way to curb excessive female sexual desire. Another reflection of the perceived danger posed by female sexuality is the strict separation of the sexes, enforced through practices such as veiling women's bodies, restricting them to the home, and the Quranic directive against men and women gazing at one another. Tell the believing men that they should lower their gaze and guard their private parts. This is purer for them. Surely Allah is aware of what they do. And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their private parts and not show their charms. Dr. Hill described being subjected to this rule in practice. I was told to look at the floor when I was around Muslim men. She was informed that if a woman looks at a man, that means she wants to have sex with him. Although female sexuality is seen as a source of fitna, Shira assigns men regarded as more rational and better able to exercise self-restraint, the God-given responsibility to oversee and regulate women. From this perspective, a woman who fails to comply with Shira norms, for instance, by appearing unveiled and unaccompanied in public, represents a danger to social order. In such a framework, responsibility for any sexual assault she suffers is often attributed to her own behavior, especially when combined with notions of the inherent impurity of non-Muslims. This outlook leads to non-Muslim women who appear uncovered and move freely without male supervision being labeled as sluts who are eager to entice men. In this cultural context, a Muslim man who engages in sexual activity with such a woman bears no blame. The fault lies entirely with the woman. Islamic teachings concerning the perilous nature of female sexuality and the moral inferiority of non-Muslims can reinforce and legitimize this pattern of attributing responsibility to the victim. All right, next up we have jihad and sex slavery. Here, we're gonna pause for 1 second. I was having some stream issues. I'm just gonna make sure it's running properly. And I see one commenter saying they had a hard time finding the original source here. I just linked it in the chat if you want to click on that. It should take you to the PDF. All right, we got jihad and sex slavery. Islamic Sharia contains detailed regulations governing armed conflict, including provisions related to the institution of slavery. In Islamic law, slavery arises as a consequence of warfare against non-Muslims or infidels. Non-Muslim captives taken in such conflicts are regarded as lawfully enslaved simply by virtue of their capture. These captives may then be allocated to Muslim combatants as part of the war booty spoils. They can subsequently be sold, ransomed, or retained in slavery. Historical records show that during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, Muslim forces enslaved women captured from enemy groups in more than a dozen military engagements. Under Sharia, sexual relations between a male owner and his female captive slave do not constitute zina. This is explicitly authorized in multiple Quranic passages and supported by numerous hadith precedents. Moreover, Muhammad taught that a married non-Muslim woman captured in war is automatically divorced from her previous husband by the act of capture itself. As a result, sexual intercourse between her captor owner and the formerly married captive does not amount to adultery. At first glance, it may appear incongruous to connect the classical Islamic institution of slavery with the sexual abuse of white girls in contemporary Britain, yet the historical record reveals a long-standing pattern in Islamic enslavement and sexual exploitation of white women. Historians estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 1 million Europeans were seized for profit as part of the Barbary slave trade. In 1786, when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams inquired of Tripoli's ambassador to France why the Barbary states waged war on nations that had not attacked them, Sidi Haju Abdul Rahman reportedly answered, "It was written in the Quran that all nations which had not acknowledged the Prophet were sinners, whom it was the right and duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave, and that every Muslim who was slain in this warfare was sure to go to paradise." He said also that the man who was the first to board a vessel had one slave over and above his share. In recent times, Islamic terrorist groups such as ISIS have openly asserted the right to revive Islamic slavery. A significant contemporary legal debate among Muslim scholars concerns the proper classification of Western countries that now host large Muslim immigrant populations. In classical Islamic jurisprudence, any non-Muslim nation was presumptively categorized as Dar al-Harb, the house of war, from which Muslims had the right and duty to take slaves. As articulated by the Tripoli ambassador, medieval Shira treated Dar al-Harb as the default status for infidel territories. A doctrine attributed to Muhammad further obliged Muslims residing in Dar al-Harb to perform hijra, migration, to a territory governed by Islam, particularly if they cannot freely practice their faith. This duty to migrate continues to be emphasized by many Salafi groups. In modern times, however, various adaptations have emerged to accommodate changed realities. Some authorities now classify Western nations as house of propagation, where Muslims enjoy freedom to invite others to Islam. In such circumstances, the obligation to wage jihad is thought to have been suspended. Other scholars maintain that an implicit covenant of security exists for Muslim migrants in the West. They are permitted to live and operate freely in exchange for refraining from jihad against the host society. It is worth emphasizing that the alternative classifications of Western countries, such as Dar al-Dawa or a tacit covenant of security, serve only to postpone rather than eliminate the traditional obligation to engage in jihad. For at least some Muslims with radical inclination, the issue is not whether jihad will eventually be required, but merely when the appropriate moment arrives. Certain Muslim men, lacking deep scholarly knowledge, often rationalize their grooming gang offenses by mentally recasting their victims in the role of legitimate slave property under an Islamic framework. In Rotherham, for instance, one perpetrator named Muhammad branded his victim with the letter M as a mark of ownership. Survivors had described being compelled to perform domestic tasks such as cooking and cleaning for their captors, while enduring repeated sexual violation, mirroring the treatment of household slaves. Journalist Andrew Norfolk captured this mindset when he observed, "Some of these Muslim kids have got an idea, probably because it's quite convenient for them. that Britain's been designated a land of war, so certain things have become permissible in terms of the enemy. I think some of these guys think it's okay to do stuff to white girls that they wouldn't dream of doing to Muslim girls. Next up, Dhimitude, Islam's treatment of conquered non-Muslim peoples. Here, I gotta look up this word too. You got, it's like UK English mixed in with a lot of these Muslim words, and there's like so many of these words I don't know.
Demitude.
Demitude. All right. Demitude, Islam's treatment of conquered non-Muslim peoples. Islamic jurisprudence also addresses the treatment of non-Muslim populations conquered through jihad. Classical Sharia rules on jihad, defined as warfare waged against non-Muslims to extend the domination of Islam, crystallized during the medieval era. As we have just noted, these rules divided the world into two fundamental categories: the House of Islam, territories governed by Islamic authority, and the House of War, territories under non-Muslim control. Under this framework, non-Muslims fell into one of two groups. Those residing within the House of Islam were considered protected, provided they fulfilled specific obligations and were not legitimate targets of military action. By contrast, those living in the House of War could lawfully be fought, defeated, and upon capture, enslaved. When non-Muslim communities came under Islamic rule, they were granted conditional tolerance through a formal surrender agreement known as the Dhimma Pact. This arrangement allowed dhimmis, protected non-Muslims, to retain their religion, but only on the condition that adult males paid an annual tax called the jizya, and that the entire community observed a range of restrictive regulations. As the renowned commentator Ibn Kathir explained, these rules were designed to ensure the continued humiliation, degradation, and disgrace. If a dhimmi community was deemed to have violated the pact, whether by failing to pay or by breaching any of the imposed conditions, Islamic law permitted the resumption of jihad. In such circumstances, the full Sharia regulations of war would apply. Adult males could be killed, women and children enslaved, and the property of non-Muslims seized as spoils. The Dhimma framework imposed a permanent condition of insecurity on Christian and other non-Muslim populations under Muslim sovereignty. It has supplied a religiously sanctioned cultural template that continues to underpin the abduction, forced conversion, and coerced marriage of non-Muslim girls in places such as Egypt and Pakistan. One way to view the involvement or lack thereof of British state officials in the rape gang scandal is an incorporation of dhimmi-like submissiveness. This mindset prioritizes defense to Islam and Muslim above all else, while dismissing or assigning fault to non-believers. From this perspective, the failure of authorities to act decisively against the grooming gang issue might represent a significant step in the gradual Islamization of Britain. And then next up, we're going to get into Islamic clan culture. We're going to take another break for just 1 minute here, just before we get into it. All right, Islamic clan culture. Evidence from the author and activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali at the inquiry highlights that the grooming and rape gangs operating in towns such as Rotherham, Rochdale, and others are not isolated instances of criminality, but stem from imported pre-modern clan systems embedded within certain ethno-cultural communities, reinforced by specifically Islamic collectivism. As before stated, the crimes disproportionately involve perpetrators from Pakistani heritage backgrounds, with patterns rooted in honor and shame-based dynamics that are wholly anathema to British norms. The behavior is deeply tied to tribal structures prevalent in parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Middle East, North Africa, and Somalia. Family honor is primarily vested in the conduct, modesty, and virginity of girls and women. Strict codes require obedience, covering, and restricted interaction with outsiders. Breaches within the community trigger severe sanctions, including honor killings or collective retaliation by male clan members. When the target is a non Muslim girl, particularly white British girls perceived as unguarded, dressed in Western styles, and lacking male protectors, the risk calculation shifts. No retaliation is expected from the girl's family or community, so some young men feel emboldened to treat her as property and then approach, assault, groom, share among the group, and sell her services. This proprietorial view of women escalates into organized networks that traffic girls across regions. Impunity fuels the cycle. Initial assaults without consequences create a perception of Britain as a place where such behavior carries no risk, turning vulnerable girls into commodified products. A key contrast emerged and evidenced. While similar gangs targeted Sikh girls, the Sikh community mobilized men to confront and deter the perpetrators effectively. White working class girls lacked equivalent collective protection, not least because authorities often silence concerns with accusation of racism, allowing the abuse to persist and expand into modern-day slavery. Even second, third, or fourth generation immigrants raised in Britain continue these patterns, acting as demographic clusters where the clan system reproduces itself and intensifies, regardless of the wider culture. Ongoing immigration from such clannish foreign backwaters serves only to replenish and strengthen such communities. While the foundational system is tribal rather than purely religious, Islamic elements provide ideological justification, communal shielding, and strategic expansion. Perpetrators sometimes hide action from families, mosques, and imams because the behavior brings disgrace to the community, yet remorse towards British victims is limited because non-Muslim girls are not viewed as fully human individuals deserving protection, but as unprotected outsiders available for abuse without moral consequence. This fosters widespread silence within affected communities. The inquiry evidence points to a fundamental clash of worlds. Across the West, our historic respect for the individual has, thanks to mass immigration, been overpowered by the more primitive attitudes that prevail elsewhere, according to which group membership matters first and foremost. The elite obsession with diversity has invited the latter to take advantage of the former. Scare words like Islamophobia and racism have been deployed to exploit the goodwill of Western host societies, paralyzing investigation and enforcement. Homegrown enabling factors, Islamophobia, and political correctness. Concerns have been raised that fear of accusations of Islamophobia have inhibited open discussion and effective action on group-based child sexual exploitation cases, particularly those involving grooming gangs. A series of report and analysis from the think tank Policy Exchange have documented how the charge of Islamophobia has been deployed to challenge, intimidate, or discredit individuals and organizations attempting to highlight the issue. In a 2025 research note titled The Rotherham Grooming Scandal and the Creator of the Islamophobia Definition, Policy Exchange examined connections between the scandal in Rotherham and the development of a contested definition of Islamophobia by the all-party parliamentary group on Muslims. The report highlighted the role of a key APPG staff member from Rotherham, Mabeen Hussain, who in 2015 organized a community protest against South Yorkshire police, accusing them of scapegoating Muslims amid the grooming investigations. Actions described by some local figures and inquiries as unhelpful to addressing the abuse. It also tells us a great deal about the politically correct institutional culture within Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council that in attendance at a safeguarding strategy meeting dated June 6, 2000 was an anti-racism coordinator named Bhupinder K. Maku. Similar themes appear in Policy Exchange's June 2025 publication, How Not to Tackle Grooming Gangs, which argues that accusations of Islamophobia independent of any formal definition, have been used to suppress exposure of the scandal in the pursuit of justice for victims. It recommends pausing government work on an official Islamophobia definition until the conclusions of a national grooming gangs inquiry are known. Politicians have echoed these worries in relation to proposed definitions. Shadow Equities Minister Claire Coutinho has warned that adopting such a definition, particularly one framed as targeting expressions of Muslimness, could intensify a culture of censorship, potentially granting perpetrators greater immunity by making legitimate scrutiny of patterns in grooming cases more difficult or risky for police, authorities, and the public. She had argued that these risks repeating past mistakes where fear of racist or Islamophobic labels contributed to delayed or inadequate responses. The concern to shield Muslims from criticism at all costs went hand in hand with a more general ideological shift organized around the unquestioning treatment of minorities as special victim groups. Rooted in the left liberal paradigm of the 1960s, this minoritarian outlook first scored political victories under Harold Wilson's Labor government. In time, tolerance, multiculturalism, and anti-discrimination became highly prized values in elite circles. The law, too, began to foster an environment in which challenging certain minority communities, including Muslim ones, became politically dangerous and even criminal. This enabled the grooming gangs to operate in impunity for years because authorities at every level, as we have seen, feared being labeled racist or Islamophobic more than they feared failing the girls to whom they owed a duty of care. The legal framework that underpinned this paralysis began with the Race Relations Act of 1965 and its even stronger successor in 1976. These statutes, designed to combat overt discrimination, were interpreted and expanded in ways that made any discussion of ethnicity or culture in crime patterns hazardous. The Macpherson Report, 1999, following the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, branded the police institutionally racist and introduced a definition of racism so broad that police officers and social workers became terrified of any action that could be construed as targeting ethnic minorities. Across Britain, clear evidence of organized abuse by Pakistani gangs, among other majority Muslim ethnic groups, was ignored because confronting it risked accusations of racism. The fear was not abstract. Senior officials and council staff explicitly cited concerns about so-called community relations and potential race riots as reasons for inaction. The country's transformation was greatly accelerated under Tony Blair's New Labour Project, which culminated in the Equity Act 2010. This consolidated and strengthened so-called anti-discrimination protections by adding religion as a protected characteristic alongside race. Combined with hate crime legislation under Part 3 of the Public Order Act 1986 and the Crime and Disorder Act 1998, it created an environment in which criticizing aspects of Islamic culture or patterns of offending linked to Muslim communities could be framed as racial hatred or Islamophobia. Official definitions of Islamophobia promoted by some campaign groups further blurred the line between legitimate concern and blind prejudice. The result was a chilling effect across public institutions. Police forces, social services, and local councils repeatedly chose silence or denial over robust investigation because the political and professional cost of appearing to single out Muslims was deemed too high. The Casey National Audit of 2025 confirmed this pattern, noting that authorities shied away from examining ethnicity and culture even when the data pointed overwhelmingly to Pakistani Muslim perpetrators. What went wrong is now painfully clear. The post-war liberal consensus that began with Wilson emphasized diversity, inclusion, and non-judgmentalism as supreme virtues. Multiculturalism replaced national self-confidence as the guiding principle. Long-standing British norms are around free speech, child protection, and impartial application of the law were subordinated to the need to avoid offending minority sensitivities at all costs. Liberal elites in media, politics, and the public center internalized the idea that acknowledging cultural or religious factors in crime was itself a form of bigotry. This mindset actively shielded the rape gangs by discouraging the very inquiries and interventions that could have saved thousands of children. Which I will comment on this a little bit just because that's kind of been a hot topic with the who's the guy that got killed in the UK and then the police arrested him because they thought he was racist. Here, I gotta pull it up. We did a video about it. Henry Nowak. So like basically everyone was so worried that the police in the UK were systematically racist against minorities that the minorities now receive special privileges, is basically what this is saying. Until the country rejects the fear of being called racist and restores the courage to name uncomfortable truths, the conditions that allowed these networks to thrive will remain. The inquiry records the damage without apology. Paralysis. I cannot pronounce anything today.
Paralysis.
The paralysis of our institutions was not some fluke. It was the predictable outcome of decades of legal and cultural changes that placed sensitivity above justice. Next section is the law. And again, we'll take another break, probably for just 1 minute before we get into it. The law. The law of the land has not merely failed the victims of grooming gangs, but actively enabled the perpetrators. For decades, statutes that should have delivered swift, exemplary justice were either ignored, diluted, or deliberately misapplied in a manner that protected organized networks of predominantly Pakistani Muslim men while leaving thousands of British girls without protections or redress. The legal framework governing organized sexual exploitation, commonly described in public discourse as grooming gangs, is extensive but fragmented. It consists of overlapping criminal offenses, human rights obligations, civil liabilities, and sentencing structures. While Parliament has enacted a broad suite of statutory provisions designed to criminalize sexual exploitation in all its forms, serious questions remain as to whether the law has been sufficiently coherent, proactive, or effective in preventing systematic abuse. At the core of the criminal law response lies the Sexual Offenses Act of 2003. The statute represents the principal legislative mechanics for addressing rape, sexual exploitation, and grooming. It criminalizes a wide spectrum of conduct, ranging from rape and assault by penetration to causing or inciting a child to engage in sexual activity and facilitating sexual exploitation. The Act also contains specific offenses concerning abuse of positions of trust, trafficking for sexual exploitation, and paying for the sexual services of a child. Collectively, these provisions were intended to modernize and consolidate earlier sexual offenses legislation. However, their practical operation in cases involving organized exploitation has often revealed structural limitations. The statutory framework presumes that the criminal justice system will detect and intervene early in abusive patterns of conduct. In practice, many cases of organized abuse have involved prolonged periods during which victims were groomed, trafficked, and repeatedly assaulted without meaningful intervention by authorities. Subsequent legislation, including the Serious Crime Act of 2015, expanded the concept of sexual exploitation to encompass a broader range of behaviors, including non-contact abuse and technology-facilitated exploitation. This expansion reflected an evolving understanding of grooming as a process rather than a single criminal act. Nevertheless, legislative reform has largely been reactive. It has tended to follow public scandals rather than anticipate systemic patterns of abuse. As a result, the legal framework often appears to piecemeal rather than strategic. Sorry. As a result, the legal framework often appears to be piecemeal rather than strategically designed. In cases involving organized sexual exploitation, prosecutors frequently rely on a constellation of offenses rather than any single overarching change. Perpetrators may be convinced of conspiracy to rape, trafficking. Perpetrators may be convicted of conspiracy to rape, trafficking for sexual exploitation, arranging child prostitution, and a variety of associated offenses, including drug supply and false imprisonment. Such cases demonstrate that the criminal law is capable of imposing severe sentences, including life imprisonment, where the offending is particularly grave. Yet these outcomes tend to occur only after extensive investigations and multiple failures of early intervention. The law's capacity to punish extreme wrongdoing is therefore clear, but its capacity to prevent such wrongdoing remains contestable. Another critical dimension concerns trafficking and modern slavery legislation. The Modern Slavery Act 2015 criminalizes human trafficking for sexual exploitation and provides for life sentences in the most serious cases. The intention in passing it was to recognize that organized sexual exploitation frequently involves coercion, movement of victims, and exploitation for profit. However, critics argue that the conceptual overlap between trafficking offenses and traditional sexual offenses has sometimes created an uncertainty in changing decisions. The distinction between trafficking and exploitation is not always straightforward, particularly when victims are groomed into apparent compliance rather than transported by force. This ambiguity may complicate prosecutions and reduce the deterrent effect of the law. The legal framework also extends beyond criminal liability to encompass civil and human rights obligations. Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights imposes a positive duty on the state to investigate credible allegations of rape and serious sexual assault. Courts have upheld that systemic failures in investigation may constitute breaches of fundamental rights even where perpetrators are ultimately prosecuted. This principle is of particular significance in organized exploitation cases where victims have frequently alleged prolonged institutional inaction. The law, therefore, recognizes that state authorities may bear responsibility not only for direct wrongdoing, but also for failures to prevent or respond to grave abuses. So I believe what they're getting at here is like some of these police or social workers that didn't report the crimes could face prison time, could be in trouble. Despite this extensive legal architecture, the operation of the law in practice has been inadequate. One recurring criticism is that the legal framework places significant emphasis on individual criminal acts while insufficiently addressing patterns of organized exploitation. Rape gangs typically operate through networks characterized by manipulation, coercion, and economic exploitation. The law's traditional focus on discrete offenses can obscure the systemic nature of such conduct. Although conspiracy and trafficking offenses partially address this gap, there remains no single statutory offense that fully captures the phenomenon of organized sexual exploitation at a distinctly structured form of criminality. A further difficulty lies in evidential challenges. Grooming often involves physical manipulation that undermines the credibility of victims in the eyes of investigators and juries. The legal concept of consent remains central to many sexual offenses, yet it can be ill-suited to situations involving vulnerable children conditioned by their abusers to acquiescence. Let me double check this one.
Acquiesce.
To acquiesce. While courts have recognized that apparent consent may be illusory or such contexts, the statutory framework continues to rely heavily on more straightforward forms of evidence. This has at times created barriers to prosecution and contributed to perceptions that the law inadequately reflects the reality of coercive exploitation. Moreover, The law's reliance on post hoc punishment raises broader questions about preventative capacity. Statutory offenses are designed to respond once exploitation has occurred or is imminently planned. Preventative mechanisms such as risk orders and safeguarding duties exist, but their effectiveness depends on institutional vigilance and interagency cooperation. Where such cooperation fails, the legal framework offers limited remedies beyond retrospective accountability. This is insufficient to address organized exploitation that occurs over extended periods. And then here we'll take another break for about a minute and we'll get into failure to invoke existing sentencing powers. Failure to invoke existing sentencing powers. The Crime and Disorder Act of 1998 and Sentencing Council guidelines explicitly permit, in cases of demonstrated hostility, require an uplift in the imposed sentence where an offense is aggravated by racial or religious hostility. Evidence in grooming gang trials has repeatedly shown precisely this. Victims described as white slags, white trash, kuffar bitches, or told they were only good for men like me to fuck and use like trash. Perpetrators shouted Allah Akbar and boasted of racial supremacy. Yet, as far as available public records are concerned, racial aggravations have never once been invoked against anti-white rape gangs, either by prosecutors or judges. This is in stark contrast to what tends to happen whenever white criminals are held to account for interracial crimes. Prosecutors did not hesitate, for instance, to pursue aggravated charges against Darren Osborne after he murdered a crowd of Muslims with his van in 2017, sentencing Osborne to life in prison with a minimum tariff of 43 years. The judge cited Schedule 21 to Criminal Justice Act 2003 to confirm that a murder done for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause counted alongside a terrorist connection as an aggravating factor in Osborne's crime. So that's something I didn't know. It appears that in the UK, if you commit a racially charged crime, that counts as a terrorist connection. So what Rupert Lowe is saying in this inquiry is the fact that these rape gangs are targeting white women and calling them kuffar bitches or white trash constitute this terrorist connection. But since all the judges and the prosecutors in the UK are scared to be called racist, they're not gonna take it that far, but they should if the justice system wasn't two-tiered. Sentences in rape gang cases, meanwhile, have remained at the lowest end of the scale, often 4 to 12 years for men convicted of raping dozens of children over years. Yeah, that's a very light sentence. Rather than life sentences or 20-plus year tariffs for offending rather than the life sentences or 20-plus year tariffs the offending merited. Shadow Minister for Justice Kieran Mullen drew attention at our hearings to the fact that many of those involved in rape gangs serve as little to a third to a half of their sentence. Worse still, foreign national perpetrators, many from Pakistan and other Muslim-majority countries, were rarely deported after sentencing despite clean powers under the UK Borders Act 2007. Instead, they were housed, fed, and upon release allowed to reoffend or return to their communities. In the Quilliams Foundation analysis of 264 convictions between 2005 to 2017, the overwhelming majority of perpetrators received terms that bore no relation to the lifetime harm inflicted. Even in high-profile cases such as Rotherham and Rochdale, ringleaders received effective tariffs that allowed release after serving less than half their sentence. This leniency persisted despite the organized, predatory, and repeated nature of the crimes. So they're saying that some of these rape gangs have been convicted, but they usually get let off in about half the time they were convicted for. Cultural defenses and judicial relativism. British courts repeatedly allowed cultural background to function as a de facto mitigating factor. In one Bristol case documented in the Quilliam report, a defendant argued that forcing a girl to have sex with his friends was simply Somali culture and tradition. In Rotherham, another claimed Western girls' clothing invited and provoked abuse. These arguments were entertained rather than dismissed outright. Judges and defense counsel cited cultural sensitivity to avoid empowering the far right or damaging community cohesion. The very phrase used in the Casey review to explain why cases were shelved pre-2012. The result is that men who viewed white British girls as subhuman property received discounts unavailable to any other category of offender. This is not justice under the law of the land. It is an importation of foreign honor-shame norms in the British courtroom, while the explicit... Oh, man. What was it?
Acquiesce.
Acquiesce, but this is like acquiescence. Acquiescence. Some of this British lingo I'm just unfamiliar with.
Acquiescence.
With the explicit acquiescence of senior police officers, prosecutors, and judges. Party politics. As Ayan Hirsi Ali told the inquiry, center-left parties viewed Muslim voting blocs as a protected base, and aggressive prosecution or deportation risked losing those votes. Chronic electoral dependence on such blocs thus paralyzed far too many levels of government. Political actors across the board, national, local, and devolved, knew about the organized rape gangs for decades, yet put electoral survival, so-called community relations, and fear of racism accusations before child protection. Labor Party figures proved especially guilty of making electoral calculations where they should have been looking out for the nation's children. Combined with demographic shift in swing states, these got in the way of concerned inaction. Scotland refused to hold its own inquiry before finally caving in February 2026. It continues to fail to record offender ethnicity or create specific child sexual exploitation markers. Early warnings from the 1980s onward went ignored because addressing the offending risked political cost. Politics placed retention of power above the safety of children, allowing the gangs to operate with impunity for decades. Politicians received direct briefings, sat in multi-agency meetings, read internal intelligence, and still denied knowledge, blocked inquiries, and silenced critics in order to cleave to Muslim voting blocs. This was not ignorance of the crimes, but calculated, repeated, nationwide abandonment of children. The Labour Party. The Labour Party bears primary responsibility for the longest and most deliberate cover-up. As the former Conservative councilman Liam Billington emphasized to our inquiry, Labour-dominated local councils and MPs repeatedly prioritized electoral dependence on Pakistani Muslim communities above the safety of children. Jess Phillips MP and Naz Shah MP maintained public silence on the ethnic and religious patterns of the gangs while their constituencies suffered.
Constituencies.
Constituencies suffered. Evidence shows Labour politicians prioritized avoiding far-right empowerment narratives and ensuring so-called community relations over protecting victims. In Oldham, Labour councillors and leadership received one of our whistleblower social workers' disclosures on trafficking inside council-run and semi-independent units, yet retaliated against the whistleblower and took no remedial action. The same pattern occurred in Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, Burnley, and Peterborough. Labour councils surrendered streets, ignored parental reports, and allowed perpetrators to operate, among other reasons, because Muslim voting blocs were electorally vital. So they're saying the Labor Party didn't look into the rape gangs because the Muslim voter bloc, it votes for the Labor Party. So the Labor Party was not incentivized to do anything about it because they didn't want to lose voters. Former detective constable in Rochdale rape gang whistleblower Maggie Oliver has criticized the mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, with whom Oliver herself has worked, for failing to piece together a full picture of the information necessary to combat the rape gangs that still operate in his area. Despite ordering some preliminary independent reviews in the CSE, that's child sexual exploitation, across Manchester, Burnham stands accused of focusing exclusive on the failures of the past. Oliver is on record suggesting that two trustworthy reviewers resigned from the final phase of Burnham's inquiry, dealing with the years 2019 to 2025, because they were blocked by Greater Manchester Police from accessing vital documents and speaking to some survivors. As Oliver puts it, what I had come to see and believe is that whilst the PR machine was wheeled out very well about what was already in the public arena, when it comes to leadership and courage in gripping what is going on now, unfortunately, he, Burnham, turned away. We missed a huge opportunity to bring changes that are needed. Even reviews that did produce valuable findings have seldom been followed by decisive action. Commissioned in 2017, Burnham's limited independent review concluded that authorities had failed to protect children from pedophile gangs in Manchester, Oldham, and Rochdale. However, no officers were fired or stripped of their pensions for the historic failings exposed, nor has Burnham exercised his powers as police and crime commissioner, a position he automatically holds as an extension of his mayoralty, to prosecute any of the officers found to have failed the victims of predatory gangs. Labor politicians did not merely fail to act, but actively denied that the problem existed, smeared those raising alarms, and blocked local inquiries that would have revealed the full scale. They sacrificed thousands of white working-class girls to its electoral alliance with Pakistani Muslim communities and to the general reputation of multiculturalism among the public. Such institutional paralysis was not accidental but political, for even when a few Labour politicians such as Sarah Champion did speak up, they were dismissed. In Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford, Telford, and dozens of other towns, Labour-controlled councils and police forces repeatedly shelved investigations, threatened whistleblowers with racism accusations, and instructed officers not to record the ethnicity of perpetrators. In 2014, J report exposed how Labour councillors and senior officials in Rotherham dismissed the systematic rape of 1,400 girls because to do otherwise risked alienating the Pakistani community. This pattern was repeated nationwide. So they were dismissing accusations of rape by these children because they didn't want to lose voters, because the Labour Party gets the Pakistani community's vote. This betrayal continued into government. In January 2025, Labour MPs voted en masse against a Conservative amendment calling for a nationwide statutory inquiry into grooming gangs. So that's what people in the US would call pedophile protectors. They call, like, I don't know, Trump or Trump supporters pedophile protectors. It looks like in the US, the Labour Party is the party of pedophile protectors. The amendment was defeated by 364 votes to 111. Sir Keir Starmer and his frontbench abstained or opposed the measure, dismissing public concern as far-right agitation. It took sustained external pressure, including the damning Casey National Audit, this independent inquiry into public outrage, to force a U-turn in June. Even then, the government watered down local inquiries with reports that plans for 5 separate reviews were quietly dropped to avoid offending Pakistanis. Jess Phillips, appointed safeguarding minister, had much to do with his show of contempt by the Labour Party, Survivors resigned from her victim panel in disgust, condemning the process as a sham. Phillips apologized for delays but retained the full backing of Sir Keir Starmer. Under her watch, ethnicity recording remains patchy, and the anti-white aspect of these horrendous crimes continues to be downplayed. This is the same Labour Party that has consistently weaponized accusations of Islamophobia to silence anyone who stated the obvious, that the gangs were and remain overwhelmingly Pakistani men. As a result, the nation has suffered decades of state-enabled child rape on an industrial scale. National Inquiry. The Labour government's so-called independent inquiry into grooming gangs, announced in December 2025 and chaired by Baroness Anne Longfield, is a masterclass in institutional evasion. Its draft terms of reference, finalized in March 2026, deliberately confine the scope to group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse in a handful of relevant local areas. The inquiry is explicitly time-limited, targeted and proportionate, and framed as an exercise in examining failures in practice and obstruction by statutory services. There is no mandate to examine the national scale of the problem, the overwhelming ethnic and religious profile of the perpetrators, the honor and shame-based cultural drivers, or the role of political correctness and electoral cynicism in allowing the abuse to flourish for decades. Victims and survivors are notionally placed at the center, yet the terms of reference carefully avoid the very question that the public and the survivors have demanded be answered for decades. This is not an inquiry designed to deliver truth or justice. It is a containment exercise. By narrowing the focus to local operational failures and in excluding any systematic analysis of the demographic, cultural, and religious patterns that witnesses have repeatedly described, the government has ensured that the most uncomfortable truths, not least those that implicate Labor's own chronic dependence on certain voting blocs, will never be confronted. The very government that once resisted a national inquiry has now given us one with terms so tightly drafted that it cannot possibly disturb the political consensus that enabled the rape gangs. None of this will expose what really happened. It is structured precisely so that it cannot. While the core grooming gangs were overwhelmingly Pakistani Muslim networks operating with political protection, the Labour Party's complicity went far beyond mere negligence. In multiple documented cases, both sitting and former Labour councillors and figures were themselves perpetrators of sexual abuse. Either that, or they directly shielded abusers within the grooming gang ecosystem. This was not a coincidence. It was the inevitable consequence of a party that treated Pakistani Muslim communities as precious vote banks, even while its own members were raping children or tipping off predators. Direct perpetrators within Labour ranks. Okay, so it looks like some of these rape gangs were actual Labour politicians in the UK. That's crazy. I actually am not aware of this. Lord Nazir Ahmed, formerly Labour councillor in the Wrotham and Labour peer, was convicted in 2022 of multiple child sex offences, including rape of a 13-year-old girl, jailed for 5.5 years. Ahmed had been a Labour councillor since 1990 and was elevated to the peerage by Blair. Survivors described him as part of the same networks that enabled Rotherham's grooming gangs. A survivor publicly demanded that he be stripped of his peerage and truly shamed. Yeah, I mean, it's a politician that raped a child, and he only got 5.5 years. Talk about soft on crime policies. The former Labour councillor Liran Veilman pleaded guilty to sex offences against a child after approaching a 13-year-old and asking if she was a virgin. The Labour councillor Carol Clark faced formal complaints after allegedly warning her pedophile son of his impending arrest in a grooming-related investigation while simultaneously voting on grooming gang matters. The former Labour MP Ivor Kaplan was arrested for grooming a 15-year-old child in 2025. What the fuck? These were not isolated bad apples. They were labor members operated in the very councils, Rotherham, Rochdale, Oldham, and so on, where grooming gangs thrived under political cover. Yeah, it might be like a whole conspiracy. Enablers in position of power. Beyond direct offending, senior labor figures either failed to crack down on rape gangs or obstructed efforts to do so. Sean Wright, labor counselor, Rotherham Children's Services lead from 2005 to 2010, remained in post despite knowing about the scale of the abuse, resigned only after the J report exposed his department's catastrophic failure. Roger Stone, Labor Council leader, Rotherham from 2003 to 2014, presided over local government during the cover-up documented in the J report. Multiple Rotherham labor councillors interfered in police investigations, tipped off perpetrators, or dismissed victims as making lifestyle choices to protect community relations and votes. While Sir Keir Starmer was the director of public prosecutions, it has been reported that 13,000 suspected rape gang members and pedophilias were let off with warning letters. That's the guy that's in charge of the UK right now. As stated earlier, the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, repeatedly insisted there were no grooming gangs operating in the city. He described evidence from whistleblowers as politically motivated. He told the London Assembly that child exploitation in the capital is a far more complex matter and does not fit the grooming style patterns on display across deprived northern towns. These statements he made despite the fact that the Metropolitan Police had in its possession reports of young girls being plied with alcohol and drugs, then raped by groups of men in hotels and other locations across London. A Daily Express investigation revealed that Khan had direct access to HM Inspectorate of Constabulary documents detailing the very patterns of offending he had denied. Khan read those files, yet continued to deny the existence of grooming gangs in public. Overall, the Labour Party did not just fail to prosecute the gangs. In some cases, its own members were the abusers, and in most cases, its councillors, leaders, and ministers put loyalty to Pakistani Muslim blocs before children's safety. No other political party has such a well-documented track record of direct involvement with and institutional protection of industrial-scale child rape. This was in large part due to Labour's own electoral self-interest. And then here, yo, what up? We're gonna take just one break for like 1 or 2 minutes. Dude, I'm reading the rape gang report.
What's that?
You know the grooming gangs in the UK?
Yeah.
The like government released like a Durham report style on it.
Hmm.
Yeah, released it today. I'm streaming it, reading it all.
I see.
Yeah. The Conservative Party, when holding national power from 2010 onwards, failed to impose mandatory ethnicity recordings to CSE offenders and failed to launch a nationwide statutory inquiry despite the scale becoming public through the Rotherham J report and other local revelations. Successive conservative-led governments allowed the same local cover-ups to continue unchecked in non-labor areas and did nothing to force data transparency or protect children outside labor strongholds. This national political environment under conservative administrations permitted the gangs to operate for another decade without systemic disruption. A proud Islamophile, the former conservative minister Rory Stewart is a standout example of the Malays within the party.
Malays.
Of the Malays within the party. Stewart once stated on his podcast with Alistair Campbell, The Rest is Politics, that the grooming gang phenomenon is more than a small-scale blight largely confined to the north of England. I wonder if we can find that. Yeah, maybe I'll look for it when I'm editing the video, see if I can find a clip of that podcast. If you search it in Google, Google says that the Rape Gang Inquiry Report stating that Stewart once stated on his podcast with Alistair Campbell, The Rest is Politics, that the grooming gang phenomenon is more than a small-scale blight largely confined to the north of England.
I don't think you can say the R word on YouTube.
You can, just not in the first couple of minutes, but it's fine. But if you search it in Google, Google says that Rory Stewart did not state that. But I think they have a source on it here, actually. Oh, okay. Yeah, it looks like he basically just downplayed the rape gangs, and he was a conservative member. Like, he wasn't part of the Labor Party. At the very least, this downplays the national pattern documented in witness statements from towns and cities across the country and reinforced the political reluctance to confront the full scale. Sammy Woodhouse met David Cameron as early as 2015 and told him everything she knew, up to and including the fact that many child victims were still being criminalized. A number of prominent figures within the Conservative Party have become more vocal about the rape gangs phenomenon amid the issue's rising political salience. Even so, Conservative Prime Ministers from David Cameron to Rishi Sunak did very little in government. Scottish politics. John Lamont MP's evidence to our inquiry shows that the same reluctance operated north of the English border. Successive Scottish governments across parties but with clear Labour influence in earlier periods refused to commission a dedicated national inquiry into grooming gangs, failed to introduce specific CSE markers, and fell short of routinely recording the ethnicity of offenders. This data gap prevented the development of any proper national picture and enabled rape gang networks to continue unchecked in both urban and rural Scotland. Pregnancy, abortion, and child born of rape. Gangs deliberately used pregnancy as a tool of control. Girls as young as 4 were raped repeatedly, some until they became pregnant. That is a little misleading because obviously the 4-year-olds weren't getting pregnant. It was like the older ones, but still. Perpetrators then exploited the pregnancy to bind the victims to them, prevent escape, and exert ongoing coercion. Victims endured multiple pregnancies while still children themselves. Some miscarried under the physical and emotional trauma. Others were coerced into abortions. Those who carried to term gave birth as children and were left without support, education, or protection. Many of these victims had themselves been born of rape to mothers who suffered identical exploitation. The state would often remove the babies for adoption or place them into the same failing care system while leaving the young mothers in the environments where the abuse continued. Intergenerational trauma became institutionalized. Abortions were sometimes arranged by the perpetrators or their associates, often in backstreet conditions that caused lasting physical damage. Medical services recorded the pregnancies and injuries but discharged the girls back to the abusers without safeguarding or long-term support. Social services and the NHS treated the pregnancies as isolated medical events rather than evidence of organized child rape. The state severed the maternal bond while failing to break the cycle of abuse. Other babies remained with mothers who were themselves still children, producing immediate harm, typically involving a disrupted education, substance addiction, mental collapse, and repeated contact with the criminal justice system. Victims who had been born of rape to earlier victims described the same patterns repeating across generations. Here, 1 second. I'm checking on my stream. It looks like it was having some issues. Okay, I think we're back. Okay, the connection's not that great. And repeated contact with the criminal justice system. Generations. It's a little choppy, but whatever. We're reading a PDF. It doesn't have to be perfect. Every statutory agency encountered these pregnancies. Hospitals and sexual health clinics recorded genital injuries, STIs, and pregnancies in 11 to 16-year-olds, but made no protective referrals. Mental health services discharged girls after suicide attempts linked to the pregnancies without trauma care. Social services closed cases or returned the young mothers to risk environments. Police failed to investigate the rape that caused the pregnancies, even when the perpetrators were named and known. Licensing authorities allowed the taxis that transported pregnant girls to continue operating. The family law courts made matters worse for victims across the board, often by awarding rapists parental rights over the very children begotten by their heinous crimes. In some cases, such rapists have even been allowed to apply for a contact order to meet their grandchildren. Here we have like an impact statement on the survivors. And then the conclusions. So let's see if there's anything else though. Okay, yeah. So the conclusion. The evidence from high-profile convictions and compiled data on group-based child sexual exploitation indicates a clear overrepresentation of Pakistani Muslim men as members of the rape gangs. However, when examining the religious dimension, often inferred from published names in court records and reliable reporting, the proportion of Muslim perpetrators appears even higher than the ethnic Pakistani figure alone would suggest. Analysis of conviction lists such as those compiled by researchers reviewing cases from the late 1990s onwards have found that approximately 90% of those convicted in relevant grooming gang cases bore distinctively Muslim names, a stark contrast to the roughly 6% Muslim proportion of the overall population. So Muslims make up 6% of UK's population, but they commit 90% of the grooming gang rapes. This pattern arises because nearly all documented Pakistani perpetrators in these cases have Muslim names, and additional convictions have involved Muslim men from other backgrounds like Somalia, Iran, Syria, Turkey, and other mixed groups with predominantly Islamic names. Non-Muslim participants remain exceptions, often isolated incidents in smaller or mixed groups. These reoccurring observations drawn from judicial outcomes, inquiries, and other public records establish a basis for advocating improved official data collection of the religion of perpetrators in group-based child sexual exploitation cases. Current national data frequently lack robust recording of ethnicity, and religion is even less systematically captured, limiting evidence-based analysis and responses. Enhanced mandatory recording of both ethnicity and religion alongside other characteristics for aspects and convicted offenders in these offenses would enable clear identification of patterns, better informed prevention strategies, and more proportionate policy interventions, while addressing long-standing criticism of data inadequacies highlighted in government reviews and reports. The evidence heard by this inquiry is unequivocal, overwhelming, and devastating in its clarity. Organized networks of Muslim men systematically raped, trafficked, drugged, impregnated, and destroyed the lives of thousands upon thousands of British children across every region of the United Kingdom for decades, when the documented patterns from Rotherham, Telford, Rochdale, Oxford, Newcastle, Oldham, Huddersfield, Peterborough, Burnley, Tameside, and dozens of other towns and cities are extrapolated nationally, the scale reaches at least 250,000 victims. This is not a collection of isolated local scandals. It is a national scandal of industrial-scale child rape and modern-day slavery enabled, protected, and prolonged by the deliberate failures of the British state at every single level. The testimony of the survivors and their families leaves no room for denial or equivocation. Sally watched her daughter's life unravel. Although her daughter has admitted to lying on occasion, the police privately acknowledged grooming, yet in public communications treated her only as a liar. Marlon had his parental authority stripped away so that his daughter could be returned to the very place where she was raped. Whitney's reports of exploitation were dismissed, while her own childhood trauma was used to undermine her credibility as a mother. Rachel saw her 12-year-old autistic daughter discouraged from pursuing justice, bullied relentlessly, and ultimately driven to her death by an overdose after the authorities failed her at every turn. Fiona, Michelle, Chloe, Marie, Grace, Kate, Anna, Jen, Leanne, Taylor, Jane, Lily, and so many others described the same relentless pattern: repeated rape, gang rape, blackmail with filmed abuse, pregnancies used as weapons of control, marriages, coerced abortions, and the birth of children who entered the world already condemned to the same cycle. These were not all vulnerable children in the narrow sense the authorities preferred to believe. Some came from stable homes, middle-class families, and loving parents. These perpetrators targeted them precisely because they were unguarded by the collective male protection that some minority groups could mobilize. The gangs operated under an honor and shame-based clan code that treated non-Muslims, especially white working-class girls, as property available for sexual use. They transported victims between towns, shared them among brothers and friends, forced conversions to Islam, followed by unregistered religious marriages, and justified the abuse by describing the girls as easy meat, white trash, or morally inferior. The same networks targeted Sikh girls until Sikh communities responded with collective male protection. White girls received no such defense. Every institution that existed to protect children instead enabled the gangs. Police forces across England and Scotland discouraged reporting, criminalized victims, destroyed evidence, allowed known rapists to walk free on bail, and in some cases actively participated in or shielded the networks. Social care removed parental authority, placed children in trafficking hubs, inside children's homes, in semi-independent units. Closed cases despite clear evidence of exploitation, destroyed records, and retaliated against whistleblowers. The NHS recorded genital injuries, multiple STIs in 13-year-olds, pregnancies caused by rape, and suicide attempts, yet discharged the children back to their abusers the same night with no safeguarding or trauma care. Schools watched older men collect girls at the gates, heard disclosures of rape in toilets and excluded the victims rather than protecting them. Taxi licensing authorities renewed permits for the very drivers who formed the logistical backbone of the trafficking networks and collapsed in the face of organized protest when basic safety measures were proposed. The media self-censored the ethnic and religious pattern for fear of being labeled racist. Social media platforms became the primary tool for initial grooming. Distribution of rape videos and coordination between politics, especially the Labor Party, bears the heaviest responsibility. Councillors and MPs sat on the very authority that covered up the abuse. They were briefed as early as 2003 through the CROP multi-agency group, yet later denied knowledge. When finally forced to act, the Labor government produced a national inquiry whose terms of reference are so tightly drawn, limited to group-based child sexual exploitation in a handful of relevant local areas, time-limited and deliberately excluding any systematic examination of the demographic, cultural, and religious drivers, that it cannot possibly confront the truths that the inquiry has heard. Labor did not merely fail to protect children, it actively obstructed justice, suppressed ethnicity data, voted against a proper national inquiry, and sacrificed tens of thousands of white working-class girls on the altar of multiculturalism and electoral arithmetic. The Conservative Party, while in national government from 2010 onwards, also failed. It did not impose mandatory ethnicity recording, nor did it launch a nationwide statutory inquiry despite the Rotherham J report and other revelations. Rory Stewart, a former Conservative minister, publicly described the issue as a small problem confined to the north of England. He downplayed the national reality and thus showed the attitude of, at the very least, a section of the party. Scottish politics mirrored the same reluctance, refusing a dedicated inquiry and failing to record offender ethnicity. The human cost is incalculable and permanent. Survivors carry lifelong PTSD, complex trauma, addiction, chronic physical pain, interrupted education, criminal records, lost children, and unrelenting fear. Many have attempted suicide repeatedly, and some succeeded. Others lost their own children to the same failing system that failed them. The gangs used pregnancy as a deliberate weapon of control, and the state compounded the harm by removing babies for adoption or placing them in care while abandoning the young mothers in the environments where the abuse continued. Intergenerational trauma has been institutionalized. The state recorded the injuries, the STIs, the pregnancies, and the disclosures, yet chose votes, so-called community relations, and fear of racism accusations over the protection of British children. Whistleblowers who tried to expose the truths, such as a social worker, Cavern Vines, Tommy Robinson, and countless protective parents, were suspended, bankrupted, subjected to dawn raids, asset freezing, and gag orders. The rule of law failed, and racial and religious aggravation was almost never applied to the few that were convicted. Foreign national offenders were rarely deported, and sentences bore no relation to the lifetime of destruction inflicted. This inquiry has heard the testimony, it has seen the documents, it has recorded the names of officers, social workers, counselors, ministers, and institutions that failed. The evidence is now overwhelming and irrefutable. The rape gangs did not operate in the shadows, but with the active or passive consent of the British state. The betrayal was total. So that's the conclusion, which is pretty good, to be honest. There is some more here. We're going to skim through. They have like some recommendations. They talk about a little bit of a response. Or they're saying here the victims need to be placed at the center of the response. And then they talk about how they recommend sentencing. What else do we have? They also recommend compensation for the victims and the victim's family. And they lay out a legislative response, which I do recommend you check this out. But for the most part, that's the end of the report